Hello. First time here? Welcome. If you're back for more, it's great to have you. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Now sit back and relax. Yesterday, something terrifying happened to me at my local Walmart. It was Black Friday, and my fiancé and I had our eyes on a printer that was on sale. We also planned to grab some other discounted Christmas gifts. We entered the store together, but then went our separate ways to tackle our shopping. I reached the printer display and decided to wait in the area for my fiancé, who I knew should be coming back soon. As I stood there, I pulled out my phone to text him and moved the cart out of the aisle, right in front of the printer, since I noticed people behind me. A man walked past me and, to my surprise, turned around to take a picture of the display. I instinctively moved aside, not wanting to be in some stranger's photo, but I didn't think much of it at the time. What was strange, though, was that after he took the picture, he stayed there, just hovering, looking around aimlessly with his phone still in hand, unsure of what to do next. At this point, I decided to stay aware of my surroundings, not wanting to be in anyone's way while I waited for my fiancé. I even thought to myself that this guy seemed a bit confused, just like me, not sure what to do next. But then, he turned around and, without any real reason, started to take a photo of a pair of boys' boxers on the rack. I saw the flash from his phone, and he acted as though he had taken the picture, but something about it seemed off. It didn't seem like the picture was really captured. Feeling unsettled, I decided to wrap up my shopping and leave. But as I started to walk away, I noticed the guy was now moving around, waving his phone. I tried to act casual, pretending I wasn't sure what to do, but the guy stopped again and just stared around, still looking confused. That's when things started to feel strange. I was staring directly at him the whole time, and it was clear he noticed me watching. Despite being only a few feet away, he didn't seem to make any move to take a picture. I figured that was enough, so I decided to leave the area. But when I turned to go, I realized he was following me. I stopped in my tracks, turned to face him, and he walked past me, only to stop a few feet away. When I turned to look at him again, he turned as well, then walked straight past me to grab the printer I had been eyeing. At this point, I started to get really nervous. I immediately called my fiancé and, without mentioning my concerns, asked him where he was and when he'd be back near the printers. I was trying not to seem obvious about what I was feeling, especially with an older lady trying to get through the aisle. As I continued talking to my fiancé, I saw that the man still hadn't stopped moving. His phone was still in his hand, the camera app still open, and he kept waving it around, never once turning off the camera. Something wasn't right. As he is grabbing the printer, he aligns his phone to the edge of the printer box to perfectly leave his phone camera pointing directly at me. If you have an iPhone, you know you can use the volume button to take pictures, and that's exactly where this guy's finger was. He proceeds to try and distract me to tell me that the older lady was trying to get through. All the while, he was laughing and smiling to the lady, talking about how he couldn't believe I was just standing there. He walks away with her, and that's when I started to realize fully that there's no way that what had just happened was a normal situation. It's also interesting that once I was asking my fiancé where he was and when he'd be back there, that he started to gather himself to leave, right? So I followed after the lady and apologized to her, saying, I was scared the man that was just talking to her was trying to take a picture of me. This lady said the man was talking to her about me and she basically ignored him and he went the other way. That's when it clicked that I should just go ask the guy if he had just taken pictures of me. It shouldn't be that big of a deal if it's a misunderstanding and I'm just in his way. I wasn't in his way at all. Well, when I ask him, he looks at me all shocked, confused, and goes on to say, What? What are you talking about? What? I was like, yeah, back at the printers. I thought I'd seen you take pictures of me. And at the flip of a switch, he lost his mind. He started screaming at me, calling me all sorts of crazy expletives, asking me what's wrong with me? Who do you think you are? Telling me to do all sorts of terrible things. He went on and started yelling me, and at this point, I was just like, just show me the pictures to prove you didn't. He refused to do it and again started screaming at me, and that I can call the cops if I want to. Another thankful for had left to get a manager. So when I tell him that I'm going to call the police, He walks away and disappears for about 5 minutes. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to show me your phone either way. If someone approached me scared or wondering if they took my photo, I'd be confused. Yes. But then apologized if I scared them, and I'd have no issue showing them my stuff. At this point, I was having a full-blown panic attack in Walmart and I couldn't breathe, almost gasping for air. All this time, I'm on the phone with my fiancé, unable to tell him where exactly I am. All I could say was the clothes by the register, which really doesn't help because all the clothes are near there. When he comes back, he turns to my fiancé and tells him to shut his mouth, and he starts freaking out again. He's doing all this in front of the manager at this point, and he says to hold on and makes a call to his apparent girlfriend to come beat me up and my fiancé because I said he took pictures of me when buying a printer. He seemed really weird and didn't seem to know exactly what he was saying to her. At this point, security comes because he's threatening to hurt us and takes him somewhere else to get his side of the story. When the police actually do show up, they take his story and look through his phone and then take mine. They informed me they found nothing in pictures recently deleted or text of me. We all know he probably already deleted whatever evidence he had when he ran away when I threatened to call the cops or any other apps he has. I'm sorry, but no person that is innocent reacts in this type of manner. Like, I didn't even approach him accusing him that he in fact took a picture of me. I just asked him if he took any pictures of me, and when he didn't understand what I was saying, I just explained what I thought I'd seen. The police informed me that he will be charged with disorderly conduct. I'm not sure if this means he was arrested or not because I had no idea where he was when the officer left me. I'm sure some people will think I'm over-exaggerating or something like that, but anyone who knows me in these kinds of situations, I will usually ignore the person and pay them no mind. Like the other day, some dirty, gross old man was saying something really perverted to me as I was bent over doing something to the car's floor mat, and I ignored him, then left. I'm not one to usually care about this too much, and I'm sure we all have at some point felt like someone was following them and never said anything to them. If I notice someone around me a lot in a store and I'm alone, I will of course stay aware. As a woman, I have to pay attention to these small details going on around me. I'm confident that the man never intended to buy a printer, and now that he had a printer in his car tonight confronted him, he can't just go and put it back. So he'll probably end up returning it to the store, or his quote-unquote girlfriend will. It was way over 24 hours later. I still keep having panic attacks where it feels like I can't breathe. I shake and my chest feels like it's sinking in. This is honestly the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my personal safety, and I've never been so scared in my life. And that right there should tell you how odd of the situation that felt to me. I just don't know what to do. I have an 11-month-old daughter, and every cry and scream she makes is very triggering to me and starts to make me get anxious even more so. I feel like the people around me don't understand why this has had such a large impact on me emotionally. I mean, I don't understand it either since I'm technically okay. But knowing how close I came to something so bad is just so scary, and how am I supposed to go around pretending that that's not traumatic? I'm just so scared that this man was taking pictures of me. I'm not sure why either. It's not hard to hide a picture in your phone by changing apps or fake apps or other messaging apps. I'm scared for my life that whenever I go out in public, I may run into him or someone else he potentially sent those pictures to, and either they plan to kidnap me or somehow hurt me. I live in an area that is high in human trafficking rates, and this is something that has been happening to a lot of women around here. Multiple times at the same Walmart. A lot of people get it on video, but I just couldn't. I know this just happened, but I'm so scared this feeling will never go away while I still live in the same area. I went on a camping trip with my buddy from college. I'll call him Andrew to keep both of our identities private. We'd been friends for less than a year, and both of us loved the forest and hiking. However, we'd never actually stayed overnight in nature before. This trip was during spring break, and we'd been planning it for a while. We chose a trail we were familiar with and even had a rough idea of where we wanted to set up. The day of the trip, we set out without any second thoughts, happy to see that the trail was empty. We specifically chose this trail because it wasn't a busy spot, and we liked the idea of being alone. The trail took us about 6 miles into the forest, and when we reached the area where we wanted to camp, we pitched our tents. We had a small meal just before the sun started to set, then began gathering large stones and sticks to build a fire. We got it going right as darkness settled in. In a somewhat irresponsible move, we brought along a pack of beers and started drinking, talking, and hanging out by the fire. We had some great conversations and fun, but a couple of hours later, we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire and crawled into our tents to sleep. I fell asleep pretty quickly, lulled by the peaceful sounds of the forest. But throughout the night, I kept waking up. It wasn't due to any specific noise. I just kept jerking awake for no apparent reason. I figured it was just my unfamiliarity with being out in the woods at night, but it still left me with an uneasy feeling. Then, on maybe my fourth or fifth time waking up, I heard the zipper of Andrew's tent. I figured he was probably going to the bathroom or something, but after only a few steps, I heard him open his backpack and start rummaging through it. I waited, and after about 30 seconds with no other noise, it was like he was just standing outside his tent. I sat up, eventually unzipped my own tent, and peered out. As soon as the zipper sounded, I heard Andrew's footsteps hurry away from the front of my tent. By the time I stuck my head out, he was crouching down, quickly shoving something back into his backpack. He turned and looked at me with a concerned expression. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He stared at me for a moment before nodding, but something about the situation immediately felt wrong. I climbed out of my tent and stood up, asking him what he was doing. He said he was having trouble sleeping and just came out for some fresh air. But while he was talking, I noticed something. The back end of a handgun was sticking out of his backpack. My face went pale, and I glanced back at Andrew, trying to hide my reaction. But he already knew that I saw it. We stared at each other for a few strange seconds before he turned and went back into his tent without saying another word. I'd never seen him act like that before, and the guilty look on his face was unmistakable. It was already odd that he hadn't mentioned bringing a gun, but the way he was acting made everything feel even more unsettling. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting outside the tents and waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I packed up everything and left. After that day, Andrew never contacted me again, which I suppose confirms that something wasn't right about that night. I'll never know for sure what would have happened or why it happened, but I know I was lucky to get out of there before finding out. The windshield wipers struggled against the torrential downpour as I squinted through the glass, desperately searching for any signs of life along the lonely highway. I'd been driving for hours, my grip tightening on the steering wheel, cursing myself for taking this shortcut. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotonous sound of rain battering the roof. I reached to turn it up, hoping for a weather update or any kind of news that might offer some relief. Instead, the voice on the other end made my blood run cold. Asterisk repeat. Be on the lookout for escaped convict, Michael Reeves. Asterisk. Asterisk last seen near County Road 17. Reeves is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Do not approach. Asterisk I glanced at my GPS, my heart skipping a beat, County Road 17, the very road I was on. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness beyond my headlights. That's when I saw him, a figure on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. As I drew closer, more details emerged. A man, drenched to the bone, his clothes hanging heavily on his frail frame. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the pang of empathy, remembering the times I'd been stranded myself. Or maybe it was the nagging voice in my head telling me that the news could be about anyone. What were the odds it was actually this man? Whatever the reason, I found myself slowing down and pulling over. The tires crunched against the gravel shoulder as the man jogged to the passenger side, and I cracked the window just a fraction. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I've been out here for hours. My car broke down a few miles back." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. "Where are you headed?" "Next town over would be great," he replied, offering a strained smile. "I've got family there who can help me out." Against every instinct, I unlocked the door. "Hop in," I said, trying to steady my voice. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else. Something faintly metallic, but I couldn't quite place it. As I pulled back onto the road, I snuck a quick glance at him. He was younger than I'd initially thought, probably in his early 30s. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he had a few days' worth of stubble on his chin. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, dark and intense, darting around the car's interior, as if cataloging every detail. "I'm Jack," I said, breaking the awkward silence. "What's your name?" He hesitated for just a moment too long. "Mike," he finally answered. "Thanks again for stopping. Not many people would pick up a stranger in weather like this." I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Well, I'd hope someone would do the same for me if I were in your shoes." We drove in silence for a while. The only sound, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the dull roar of rain on the roof. I could feel Mike's eyes on me, studying me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "So, Jack," he said suddenly, making me jump, "what brings you out to this lonely stretch of road on a night like this?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Just heading home from a business trip. Thought I'd take a shortcut, but I'm starting to regret that decision." Mike chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. Funny how shortcuts often end up taking us places we never intended to go, isn't it? I nodded, unsure how to respond. The silence stretched between us again, heavy and oppressive. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my palms sweating despite the car's cool interior. "Mind if I turn on the radio?" Mike asked, his hand already reaching for the dial. "Sure," I said, grateful for any distraction. He fiddled with the tuner, static filling the car before a clear signal came through. It was the same news station I'd been listening to earlier. Once again, police are urging citizens to be on high alert. Escaped convict Michael Reeves is still at large. Reeves was serving a life sentence for multiple homicides and is considered extremely dangerous. He was last seen wearing a dark jacket and jeans. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the description matched my passenger exactly. My eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, meeting Michael's gaze. In that moment, I knew he knew that I knew. The atmosphere in the car changed instantly. The tension, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now crackled like electricity. I could see Michael's hand moving slowly towards his jacket pocket. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and menacing. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. We were miles from anywhere, no other cars on the road. If I stopped now, I was as good as dead. I said, "Pull over." Michael growled, his hand now clearly gripping something in his pocket. Instead of slowing down, I did the only thing I could think of. I floored it. The car lurched forward, tires fighting for grip on the rain-slicked road. Michael was thrown back in his seat, cursing loudly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, struggling to right himself. "Saving my life," I answered, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse, played out at 80 miles per hour on a winding rain-soaked highway. Michael lunged for the wheel, trying to force us off the road. I fought back, swerving wildly, praying to whatever higher power might be listening that we wouldn't crash. In the chaos, Michael's hand slipped from his pocket, and I saw what he'd been reaching for. A wicked-looking knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the dashboard. My heart nearly stopped at the sight of it. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Jack," Michael said, his voice eerily calm as he brandished the knife. "Just pull over and I promise I'll make it quick." "Not a chance," I spat back, my eyes darting between the road and the weapon. Suddenly, I saw something that made my heart leap, headlights in the distance, coming towards us. It was the first sign of another vehicle I'd seen in hours. If I could just hold out until we reached them, Michael saw them too. His face contorted with rage as he realized his window of opportunity was closing. With a roar of frustration, he lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car into a spin. The world outside became a blur of rain and darkness as we whirled across the road. I heard Michael cry out, a flash of movement as he was thrown against the passenger door. Then, with a sickening crunch, the car came to an abrupt stop. The airbag exploded in my face, temporarily disorienting me. As I fought to regain my bearings, I realized two things: the wail of sirens growing closer, and the fact that the seat beside me was empty. I fumbled with my seatbelt, every movement sending waves of pain through my battered body. Stumbling out of the wreckage, I spotted a dark figure limping away into the woods that bordered the highway. The sirens grew louder, and soon, red and blue lights flooded the night. Police cars and an ambulance screeched to a halt around me. Paramedics rushed to check me over, while I overheard an officer urgently speaking into his radio. Suspects spotted fleeing into the woods off County Road 17. All units converge on this location. He's on foot and possibly injured. As I was loaded into the ambulance, I overheard fragments of conversation from the officers. They'd been tracking Michael for hours, always just a step behind him. If I hadn't picked him up, if I hadn't heard that radio broadcast, if I hadn't taken that ill-fated shortcut, the what-ifs spun in my mind as shock began to settle in. In the days that followed, as I recovered in the hospital and gave multiple statements to the police, the full gravity of what had happened began to sink in. I had come face to face with a killer and lived to tell the tale. Michael Reeves was captured 2 days later. He was found hiding in an abandoned barn not far from where I crashed. Authorities said he'd killed 3 people since his escape. I would have been his 4th. Now, every time I see a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I think back to that rainy night. Part of me wants to stop to help someone who might genuinely be in need. But a larger part, the part that remembers the glint of that knife and the cold look in Michael's eyes, keeps me driving. Because sometimes the most dangerous shortcuts are the ones we take with our trust. Just a little background before I start. I live in a country that was once part of the Soviet Union before it collapsed. It's classified as a post-Soviet state now. Anyway, this story isn't about that. I'm currently in my final year of police training, focusing on becoming a detective specializing in murder and organized crime cases. Throughout my training, I've witnessed a lot of gruesome scenes, read through countless resolved cases, and I can confidently say that I'm not breaking any laws by sharing this story. Back in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, the newly independent countries struggled to establish their governments and law enforcement systems. People were largely impoverished, and organized crime began to rise. What I mean by that is mafia groups were forming in major cities, where law enforcement was either ineffective or corrupt and too afraid to confront these gangs. Unfortunately for me, I was born in one of those cities, home to one of the most powerful and influential mafia groups in the country. From the 1990s to the early 2000s, it was basically one giant crime scene throughout the entire country. Daily shootings, bodies in rivers, robberies, carjackings, you name it, it was happening. During my early training in 2018, I was going through the police archives as part of my studies and came across a few cases that will stay with me for a long time. I want to share one of them with you. Here's how the case went. In early autumn of 1992, when it was still warm, a young man went missing. The police knew he had ties to the local mob, but for an entire week, they couldn't locate him or his body. During this search, 3 teenage boys, aged 12 to 14, decided to go fishing at a local river. To give you an idea of the location, there was a main road, a school, and a trail that led from the school playground directly to the riverbank. It was a 3-minute walk from the playground to the river. So, the boys packed their fishing gear and, as they passed the playground, they waved hello to the school's principal, who was outside talking to a groundskeeper. The boys, known for their mischievous behavior, wanted to taunt the principal by waving at him. He ignored them, and they continued on their way to the river. It was a warm evening, and the sun was still up, around 5 p.m. The boys set up and cast their rods. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. 15 minutes. Still nothing. One of the boys, getting impatient, decided to recast his rod. Just as he started reeling it back in, something heavy was caught on the line. Excited, he shouted, "I got something! I got one! I got a bite!" The other boys rushed over, eager to see what he had caught. But as they watched, their faces went pale. There was no fish. Instead, the hook was caught in something much worse: human flesh. The boy who had been holding the fishing rod threw up when he realized he had caught a human head. A rotting human head. The boys were immediately struck with panic. They didn't know what to do as there were no cell phones and the closest building with an adult was the school. The boys dropped their fishing gear and ran back to the school, hoping to find the principal who they saw earlier. He was nowhere to be seen outside, so the boys ran into the school straight into his office. They were panicking and screaming for the principal to come because there was something horrible by the river. The principal looked at them confused and refused to come, as he thought this was one of their pranks. But when he noticed how greenish pale and panicked they were, he said in a serious voice, "This better not be one of your silly pranks. Now come on, show me what's going on." They took him right where they dropped their fishing gear and showed him the head which still had the fish hook in it. The principal stood in silence, but there was pure terror on his face. Quickly, he took the boys back to his office and rang the police. The police came, and of course the forensic team was called. Statements were taken from the boys and the principal. It was the missing man's head. The 22-year-old man was killed by the mob because he owed them money, then cut into several pieces and thrown into the river. Only his head and torso were recovered. His family was gutted. They couldn't even bury his body properly. Me, now reading their statements after more than 20 years, got me to tears. How terrible it must have been for the boys to discover the head, and for the man's family to hear that their son had been discovered in pieces. I am not a faint-hearted person or anything like that, as I chose my career to be a murder detective. But some cases and witness statements who are crying their souls out asking to find the people who did that to their loved ones sometimes gets me crying also. That just gives me the motivation and strength to find and fight these horrible people. Stay safe, everyone. I had just turned 21 and was hitting the bars pretty regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent way too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or a cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk to get downtown, but my town was generally very safe. It's a wealthy, well-off community, so walking home alone at night after drinking didn't really bother me, other than the walk itself. It was a Tuesday night, which meant pints were cheap. I wasn't completely hammered, but I was definitely more than tipsy. Instead of walking down the sidewalk where I might get picked up by the cops for public drunkenness, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. It would take longer, but it felt like a safer option and less likely that I'd run into trouble. The bike path wasn't very well lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more cautious about walking alone in the pitch-black darkness at 2 a.m. I had just turned 21 and was a bit arrogant, thinking more about women than the environment around me. I'd taken this path many times before, and it was rare to see anyone else. If I did encounter anyone, it was usually just another drunk college student with the same idea or perhaps a homeless person, but I figured that was a pretty rare occurrence. This particular night, though, I saw someone further down the path walking towards me. He had a big hiking backpack and his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I could barely make out his face, only his outline. The way he walked made it obvious he was male, and I figured he was probably just a transient. It struck me as odd to see someone walking downtown at 2 in the morning, but I thought little of it. As I got closer and was about to pass him, the guy suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I could tell he was staring at me because his head followed me as I walked by. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. As I kept walking, though, something in my gut told me something wasn't right. I stopped and turned around to see the guy still staring at me. "What?" I asked, stopping in my tracks and returning his gaze. That's when he hissed at me, like a snake, a long, vicious hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, hoping he was just being weird or maybe on something. I nervously laughed and said, "Oh, okay," and kept walking. But after a few more steps, I turned to look back. Somehow, he had managed to get closer to me without making a sound. He was completely still. I thought maybe I was just drunk and imagining things. So I turned back around and kept walking. But after a few more steps, I turned around again. This time, I could see that he was even closer. I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard him approaching behind me. What made it worse was that every time I turned around, he would stop and stand completely still. "Are you following me, buddy?" I asked, starting to panic. Once again, he let out that creepy hiss, just staring at me. Now, I was freaked out, feeling like I was some kind of prey being stalked. "Hey, screw you, man," I now yelled. In hindsight, this was a bad idea. But because I already felt like I was some sort of target, and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick, twisted guy. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off of him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malintention was apparent in them. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said, "Screw this," to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I noped it out of there and began into a full-fledged run. He started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me, pissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of my neck. "Get away from me, you sick bastard." I might have peed myself, I was so scared. All I could think to do was run as fast as I could to get inside of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long. So he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to keep a good 5 feet between us though, checking back behind me as I saw his arms reaching out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by the street lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house and I thought I would run to the safety of it inside only to see that the lights had been shut off and the doors were closed. Crap, I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house, I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris," I shouted. "Chris, open the door. Open the door." I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me. I saw the front door of my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside my house, slamming the door shut behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. "You didn't see that guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked outside. He was gone. I have no idea what happened to him. But that guy, he scared the crap out of me. This happened when I was about 7 years old, during the summer of 2011. I grew up in a small village in France, where everyone knew everyone and trust was in abundance. My parents would work in the afternoons, so they dropped me and my younger sister off at our grandparents' house before heading to work. Our cousin would also join us, and we'd spend the time playing, watching movies, and enjoying the summer. It was summer vacation, and as usual, my cousin and my sister, who were both 3 years younger than me, and I took our bikes and went for a ride around my grandparents' place. There was a field right near their house, and in front of it, there was a large parking area used by the neighbors, so it wasn't exactly isolated. We were told to return by 8 p.m. when our parents would come to pick us up. While we were hanging out there, I noticed a woman playing with her son with a water gun in front of her house. There was also a red car parked in front of her house, and I could tell it didn't belong to anyone from around the village because I knew the area so well. But I didn't think much of it at the time. A man was sitting in the car the entire time we were there, and that seemed a little strange, but it was the only odd thing I noticed. After we had dinner around 7 p.m., we asked our grandma if we could go out again on our bikes. After a lot of pleading and negotiating, she agreed but reminded us to be careful since it was getting dark and to never follow or accept anything from strangers. So we headed out again, just me, my sister, and my cousin. I'll be honest, though, something felt off, and I was so nervous that my stomach hurt. I even felt like I might cry. At the time, I thought it was because I was afraid of vomiting, since that was my biggest fear as a kid. Now, I think what I was actually feeling was anxiety. While my sister and cousin were chatting and riding together, I just sat on my bike, trying to hold back tears, watching them. We ended up staying there longer than we realized, completely losing track of time. My grandma was used to us coming back late though, but we would get scolded every time. Then the red car appeared again. Except this time, there was now 3 guys in it. They all had lots of muscles and seemed to be in their 30s. They stopped by my little sister and cousin, and being the older one, I quickly approached to see what they wanted. I was and still am a really shy person, so I didn't want to be the one to tell them to leave us alone because at that point, something was just off and I wanted to leave. The red car stops, and the guy that was sitting in the back comes out smiling and appearing very innocent. He told us, "Hey, I know where you live. We can give you a ride home." With the voice of an adult talking to a baby, first big red flag. I politely tell him that no, we're fine, and that we're about to go back to our grandparents' house anyway. He became angry. Second big red flag. He told us that he knew our grandparents and that he was here to bring us back to them. At that point, I was thinking, why would he bring us back in his car while their house is literally like 5 minutes away? I asked him how he could bring us if we had the bikes, and besides, there was only 2 seats free in the car. He became even more angry and told us to, "Hey, just get in the car. She'll get on my knees," showing my little sister that was very short. At that point, I don't really know. I'm both thinking that maybe it's true, and he's getting impatient because we're already late, and he maybe had something else to do after bringing us back. And at the same time, I just have the word run in my head. So luckily, this ends well because it turns out we were incredibly late, and our grandma had sent my grandpa to go get us. When he arrived, he asked the guy what they were doing, and they just answered that they were checking how we were and left. I told my grandpa what had happened, and I can promise you I've never seen him so enraged before. He called them all the insults in the world and called the police right when he got home. That's when 7-year-old me understood what had just happened, and I was terrified of going out for so long. Now it's okay, but I'm still so anxious about being outside even if I'm with somebody. Sadly, I don't know what happened next. I don't know if those guys were ever found. I don't know if they tried kidnapping other kids. I don't know anything. So for those 3 suspicious guys in the red car in France on a summer evening in July of 2011, never come back to our town again. The moment the power cut out and I heard that first gunshot, I knew this shift at the gas station was going to be anything but ordinary. Little did I realize, I was about to spend the longest night of my life, trapped with a desperate fugitive, struggling to survive until daylight. I'm Sarah, a night clerk at a 24-hour convenience store just off the highway. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills while I finish up my degree. Most nights, the hardest part is staying awake. But that all changed on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was around 2 a.m., and I was halfway through my shift. The store was empty as usual at that time. I was behind the counter, buried in a textbook, when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up to see a man stumbling in, drenched from the rain. He was tall, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were darting around the store, looking anxious. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, even though my gut was starting to churn. He jumped at the sound of my voice, but quickly composed himself. "Yeah, bathroom?" he asked. I pointed to the back of the store, past the coolers on the left. He nodded and hurried off. As I watched him go, I noticed he was keeping one hand pressed against his side. Something was definitely off about this guy. I was about to call my manager when the lights flickered twice and then went out completely. The sudden darkness was disorienting, leaving only the faint glow of emergency lights to cut through. "Great," I muttered, reaching for the flashlight we kept under the counter. Power outages were common during storms, but they were always a pain. That's when I heard it. The sound of a car pulling up outside, its headlights slicing through the gloom. Then another and another. I walked to the front of the store and peered out the rain-splattered windows. 3 police cruisers had pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing silently in the dark. Officers were getting out, guns drawn. My heart jumped into my throat. What the hell was happening? Don't move. The voice came from behind me, low and threatening. I turned slowly to see the man from earlier. He had a gun pointed directly at my chest. I said, "Don't move," he growled. "Okay," I said, raising my hand slowly. "Okay, just take it easy. Is there another way out of here?" he demanded. I shook my head. "Just the front door and the emergency exit, but that'll set off an alarm." He cursed under his breath, running a hand through his wet hair. That's when I saw the blood slowly soaking through his shirt where he'd been pressing against his side. "You're hurt," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His eyes narrowed. "Oh, shut up. Just shut up and let me think." Outside, I could hear muffled voices. The police were surrounding the building. "This is the police. We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up." The man's face contorted with panic and rage. "Damn it." He grabbed me roughly by the arm, pulling me away from the windows. "Get down behind the counter." Now, I complied, my legs shaking so bad I nearly fell. He crouched beside me, gun still trained on me. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Sarah." I stammered. "Okay, Sarah, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be my ticket out of here. You do exactly what I say, and you might just survive this. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Good. Now, is there a back room somewhere away from the windows?" "The stock room," I managed to say, "through that door behind us." He nodded. "All right, we're going to move there, slowly." Any sudden moves and he left the threat unspoken, but the gun pressing into my ribs made his meaning clear. We made our way to the stockroom, a cramped space filled with shelves of inventory. He closed the door behind us, then slumped against it, breathing heavily. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see how pale he was. The wound in his side was worse than I'd thought. "You need a doctor?" I said. He laughed bitterly. "Yeah. Well, that's not an option right now." "What did you do?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. His eyes hardened. "Nothing I'm going to tell you about. The less you know, the better." We fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of police activity outside and the steady drip of rain from a leaky corner of the roof. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, there was a crackle of static, and then a voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is Detective Ramirez. We know you're in there, Jackson. There's no way out. Come out now and no one has to get hurt." The man, Jackson, apparently tensed. "They're lying," he muttered. "The moment I step out that door, they'll put a bullet in my head." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him to give himself up, that it was his best chance. But the wild look in his eyes told me that would be a bad idea. Instead, I asked, "How bad is it? Your wound, I mean." He glanced down at his side, grimacing. "Bad enough? Bastard got a lucky shot in during the escape. I have some first aid training." I offered hesitantly, "If you let me, I could try to help." He stared at me for a long moment, suspicion warring with pain in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but try anything stupid." And I know I interrupted. "You'll shoot me. I get it." I found the store's first aid kit and set to work. Up close, the wound looked nasty. A deep gash that was still bleeding sluggishly. I cleaned it as best I could and applied a pressure bandage. As I worked, I tried to keep him talking, partly to distract him from the pain, partly to try and understand what was happening. "So, Jackson, that's your name, right? How'd you end up here?" He snorted. "You really want to know? Fine. I was in county lockup, awaiting trial. Some of my old associates arranged a breakout. It went sideways. I got shot. The getaway driver panicked and left me behind. I've been running ever since." "What were you in for?" I asked, taping down the edges of the bandage. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, softly, "Armed robbery. But they're trying to pin a murder on me too. A cop who got in the way." I felt a chill run down my spine. This man was dangerous, maybe even a killer, and I was trapped in a small room with him. "I didn't do it," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "The murder, I mean the robbery, yeah. That was me. But I never killed anyone." I didn't know whether to believe him or not. But looking into his eyes, I saw something there. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of hope, desperation. Why should I believe you? I asked. He shrugged, wincing at the movement. You shouldn't, but it's the truth. Not that it matters now. They'll never believe me. We lapsed into silence again. Outside, I could hear the police trying to negotiate, but Jackson ignored them. As the hours dragged on, I found myself in the surreal position of having something like a normal conversation with my captor. We talked about our lives, my studies, his troubled past. In another context, it might have been almost friendly, but reality would intrude. Every time he shifted and I caught sight of the gun, every time the police called out, I was sharply reminded of the danger I was in. As dawn began to break, Jackson grew increasingly restless. The wound was clearly wearing him down, and his options were running out. They're going to come in soon, he said, his voice raspy. When they do, I want you to know, I'm sorry for dragging you into this. I looked at him, really looked at him. Despite everything, I found myself believing him. Not necessarily about his innocence, but about his regret. It's not too late, I said softly. You could still give yourself up. Tell your side of the story. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, right. Who's going to believe a con like me? I might, I said, surprising myself. If you let me go, if you give yourself up peacefully, I'll tell them you treated me well, that you said you were innocent of the murder. It might not be much, but it's something. Jackson stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his face unreadable. Then slowly he lowered the gun. Okay, he whispered. Okay, what happened next is a blur. I walked out first, hands raised. The police rushed into the store. Jackson was led out in handcuffs. As they put him into the squad car, our eyes met one last time. There was gratitude there and something else. An unspoken understanding of the strange bond we'd formed during that long night. In the days that followed, I gave my statement to the police. True to my word, I told them how Jackson had treated me, about his claim of innocence. I'm not sure if it made any difference. I never saw Jackson again after that night. Sometimes I wonder what happened to him, if he ever got a chance to tell his side of the story. As for me, I still work the night shift at Gas and Go. But now, every time the bell above the door chimes, I look up with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, because you never know who might walk in or how they might change your life. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a quiet night shift the same way again. The old camera felt heavier than it should have, its weathered leather strap rough against my skin. I'd bought it on a whim at a flea market, charmed by its vintage look, and the seller had assured me that it still worked. Little did I know, this seemingly innocuous purchase would plunge me into a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined. As I developed the film left inside, I slowly realized with growing horror that this camera didn't just capture moments, it captured souls. My name is Alex, and I've always been fascinated by photography. There's something magical about freezing a moment in time, preserving it forever. So when I spotted the old Leica M3 at Mrs. Gillespie's stall, I couldn't resist. The price was steep, but the camera was in surprisingly good condition for its age. Oh, that old thing? Mrs. Gillespie had said, her eyes twinkling warmly. Found it at an estate sale. The previous owner was quite the traveler, they say. That camera's seen some sights. I should have asked more questions, wondered why she seemed so eager to part with such a valuable item. But I was too excited about my find to notice the slight tremor in her hand as she passed it to me, or the relief in her eyes as I walked away. At home, I examined my prize closely. The camera was indeed in excellent condition, with only minor scratches on the body. To my surprise, there was still film inside. Curious to see if it would work, I finished off the roll by snapping a few test shots around my apartment. I had a small darkroom set up in my spare bathroom, another hobby of mine. As I developed the film, a childlike excitement bubbled up in me. What kinds of images had the previous owner captured? What stories might they tell? The first few photos were unremarkable landscapes, cityscapes, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I hung them up to dry, something strange caught my eye in the next image. It was a crowded street scene, people hurrying by. But one figure stood out. A man, staring directly at the camera, his face a mask of terror. What was odd was that he seemed blurred, almost transparent, as if he were fading away. I shook my head, writing it off as a quirk of the old film. But the next photo sent a chill through me. It was a picture of a young woman, smiling at the camera. In the reflection of a shop window behind her stood the same terrified man from the previous shot. But now, he was even more transparent, reaching toward her with a desperate expression. My hands shook as I continued developing the rest of the role. Each photo was similar. Normal scenes at first glance, but always with that fading figure somewhere in the frame, growing more transparent with each shot. In the final photo, taken in what appeared to be a graveyard, the figure was barely visible at all, nothing more than a wisp of smoke among the headstones. I stared at the photos for hours, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was right there, printed on the paper. Somehow, this camera had captured a man's what? Spirit? Soul? And with each photo, it seemed to be pulling him further out of this world. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my dreams filled with fading figures and desperate silent screams. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I was determined to uncover the truth about this camera. I started with an internet search, looking for any information about haunted or cursed cameras. Most of what I found was obviously fake, stories made up for clicks or views. But buried in a forum thread, I found a post that made my heart race. My grandfather had a camera like that. Leica M3, right? Get rid of it now before it's too late. The user had deleted their account shortly after posting, but it was enough to convince me I wasn't imagining things. This camera was dangerous. I knew I should destroy it, smash it to pieces, burn the film, and forget I'd ever seen those horrifying images. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know more. I spent the next few days digging deeper, reaching out to photography experts and paranormal researchers alike. Most dismissed me outright, but a few seemed intrigued. One historian even agreed to meet with me. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. She examined the camera carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "This is no ordinary camera," she said finally. "Where did you say you got it?" I told her about the flea market, about Mrs. Gillespie. Dr. Vance nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "There are stories," she began, her voice low, "of objects that can capture more than just light. Some believe that the right combination of materials, crafted with dark intent, can create items capable of trapping the human soul." I shivered, remembering the fading figure in the photos. But why? What's the purpose? Dr. Vance's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear there. Power, Mr. Chun. The kind of power that comes from consuming the essence of others. She went on to explain her theory, that the camera was designed to slowly drain the life force from its subjects, feeding it to whoever controlled the camera. With each photo taken, the victim would fade a little more from this world. Until they're gone completely, I finished feeling sick. Dr. Vance nodded gravely. "I would strongly advise you to get rid of that camera, Mr. Chun. Destroy it if you can. Objects like that have a way of resisting attempts to be rid of them, but you must try." I left her office with my head spinning. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all an elaborate hoax, or maybe I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew. The camera was evil, and I had to destroy it. That night, I gathered everything I needed. The camera, the photos, the negatives. I drove out to an abandoned lot on the edge of town, my heart racing the entire way. Once there, I soaked everything in lighter fluid and struck a match. The flames sputtered to life, and I paused for just a moment. Then, steeling myself, I dropped the match onto the pile. The fire caught instantly. Flames leaped up, eager to devour the camera and its grisly contents. I watched, mesmerized, as the leather bubbled and peeled, the metal warping in the heat. And then I heard it, a scream, not from the outside, but from within my own mind, a howl of agony and rage that felt like it was tearing my skull apart. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head as visions flashed before my eyes. I saw the man from the photos, no longer fading, but vibrant and alive. But I saw others too, dozens, hundreds, all trapped inside the camera. And then, in the shadows, I saw the one who had imprisoned them, a figure consuming their souls like a man dying of thirst. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me gasping on the ground. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes. The camera was gone. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that destroying the camera freed those souls and ended the nightmare. But life is rarely so simple. Since that night, I felt different. I see things that others don't, flickers of movement at the corner of my eye, transparent figures that vanish when I turn to look. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear them, the trapped souls of the camera, whispering from beyond the veil. I don't know if I'll ever be rid of this curse. All I know is that I have to keep searching, keep trying to understand what happened. Because if one camera like that exists, there could be others. And next time, I'll be ready. So if you ever find yourself in a flea market or an antique shop, and you see an old camera that seems too good to be true, walk away. Some relics of the past are better left undisturbed, because you never know what might be looking back at you through that lens. In September 2018, my fiancée, her children, and I moved into our dream house. First, everything was perfect. It wasn't until a few months later that the strange occurrences started happening. The first event took place one night while my fiancée and I were in bed. We usually slept with the lights off, as I always have, and it never bothered me until this night. She started making odd noises, and I felt an unusual, almost static energy filling the room. She began mumbling in her sleep, though I couldn't make out the words. It seemed like she was struggling, and when I tried to wake her, she wouldn't stir. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the strange feeling only intensified, to the point where I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to turn on my bedside lamp, but even with the light on, she kept making those unsettling noises, and I began feeling more and more uncomfortable. Then, out of nowhere, I had a sudden, almost irrational urge to close the bathroom door, which was diagonally across from our bed. I can't explain why, but everything in me was telling me to do it. Despite being a skeptic and not believing in anything paranormal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to close that door. So, I got out of bed and started walking toward it. Just as I was a few steps away, my fiancée suddenly shot up in bed, gasping for air, and began crying uncontrollably. I rushed to her side to comfort her, and she told me through her tears that she felt like something was holding her down. She described an out-of-body experience, guessing it was sleep paralysis after looking it up later. She said she could see herself standing in the corner by the bathroom door, watching me walk toward her, which is what woke her up. Up until then, I had been a skeptic. I didn't really believe in such things, but the look of terror on her face made me believe her. After that, we both agreed that something about that room just didn't feel right. We moved to the living room couch to sleep, but things didn't settle down. Less than 30 minutes later, her 5-year-old son started screaming in terror. Given everything that had happened earlier, we were both still awake. I jumped up from the couch and rushed upstairs to find him already running down to us. We met him in the kitchen on the middle floor. After I calmed him down, he explained what had scared him. He told us, without hesitation, that he had seen black figures emerging from his wall, trying to hurt him. Now I understand that he was just 5 years old. He could have had a bad dream. However, this was the first time he had ever claimed such a thing. Even the first time he claimed to having a bad dream since I've known him, and I have been in the picture for over 2 years at this point. Again, being a skeptic just didn't seem possible in this moment, especially considering what had just happened 30 minutes before. I believed him, so I comforted him and brought him down with me and his mother to the living room to sleep with us. And my fiancée also got her daughter from her room because I didn't feel safe anymore leaving them alone. I just didn't feel safe at all. The next incident was pretty small, but I still cannot explain it. A few weeks had passed from that night, and me and my fiancée were in our living room. She was on the sofa and I was in my lazy boy. We were just watching TV and the kids were in the upstairs living room playing. I remember my fiancée's daughter distinctively came downstairs to tell us something, but she saw me. She started freaking out and crying. Us being worried, her mother went after her asking what was wrong. She said the girl next to me was mad at her now. Now this was very strange because the only ones that were there were me, my fiancé, her son, and daughter. So confused, we asked her what she meant. She directly said, "The girl in the weird white dress doesn't want me here." I remember being so thrown off from this. It made me sick, especially after what had already happened. I knew something wasn't right. She said that there was basically a little girl in a white dress next to me where I was sitting. And when she went to talk to me, she said it didn't like her. I still to this day don't even know what to make of this. A few more weeks had passed and things had almost gone back to normal, except not quite. Since that night, there seemed to be a thick tension in the air. Something had shifted. My fiancée seemed tense and easily irritable, which was very against her nature. She would fly off the handle as things just a few weeks prior she wouldn't think twice about. She just didn't seem herself. The next experience that happened follows a few weeks later. It was intense, and before I say the following, I need the reader to understand that this is the truth. This still haunts me to this day. The details are a little blurry because I honestly tried to push it out of my mind as best as I could, yet it still messes with me to this day. Okay, so it started as a regular evening. I had just gotten home from work and my fiancé and I were relaxing downstairs in the living room watching television. Everything seemed normal. However, at some point I noticed my fiancé had put on some headphones and was listening to music pretty loudly. Now at this time I really didn't think anything of it. However, this was strange because she hadn't really done that before. Especially since we were both watching television together, it kind of just seemed peculiar, but I just brushed it off. However, she just seemed really agitated towards me. I remember thinking if I had done something to upset her, trying to rack my brain as I sat there, but I truly couldn't think of anything. So again, I brushed it off. A few hours go by and she just seems increasingly agitated to the point where she basically won't look at me. She is sitting in the corner of the couch listening to loud music, ignoring me. It starts to unsettle me, so I begin to ask her what's wrong. She loses it. She starts to throw things at me, screaming at me. We fight over what until this day I cannot for the life of me think of. I don't remember even what the argument was about. Like at all, it was such a blur. However, the next thing I remember she storms upstairs. Me still upset and confused. I stay downstairs and continue watching TV, letting her go to give her a space. Maybe 30 minutes to an hour go by and I go to check on her. I find her upstairs in our bedroom on the floor and the pitch black crying on the floor. I go to ask her what's wrong, but she doesn't answer. She continues to cry on the floor for a few more minutes. I continue to try to comfort her, but it's almost as if she doesn't even notice I'm there. She then stands directly up, almost in a trance, and begins shuffling around the house slowly. I follow her asking what she's doing, but she never gives me a reply. She just continues shuffling slowly around the house with a strange look on her face. She goes from our upstairs bedroom down the stairs to our kitchen on the middle floor. She then goes to the banisters in the kitchen and drops to her knees and begins banging her head on them. At this point, I know that something extremely strange is going down, but I can't seem to help her or get her out of this trance-like stage, so I just follow her. I put my hands in front of her forehead so that she wasn't completely bashing her forehead on the banisters. I was pleading for her to stop and snap out of it, but she completely ignored me as if though I wasn't there. She then stood back up and began walking upstairs. She goes into our bedroom, walks into our bathroom, walks into our closet, and drops to her knees. At this point, she is sputtering out what seemed to be nonsense that I can't understand. She continues to bang her head on the carpeted closet floor. The whole time I'm trying to talk to her, get to her, but to no avail. Eventually, I'm over it. I'm freaked out beyond belief and I just want this to be over. So I grab her and try to lift her up. She begins almost hissing at me, trying to bite me. It frightens me, But at this point, I know that whatever is happening, I can't just let her do this. So I forcefully heard her downstairs the whole time she's cussing at me, making very strange noises. I get her to the downstairs living room and I put her on the couch. At this point, she starts laughing at me almost evil-like. However, I know my fiancé and this wasn't her. The look on her face literally wasn't her own. I could tell something had taken over her or something. So I put her on the couch asking her what was going on and what was happening. I can remember her laughing, looking me in the face saying that she's gone. She kept saying it over and over again. She's gone. She's gone. She's gone. At this point, I was terrified. I had seen enough scary movies to know what was happening. I told her that I don't accept that, and I kept trying to get to her. This happened for a few minutes. All the while, I had to almost hold her on the couch. The next thing I know, she lunges at me trying to bite me. However, this time is different. When she lunges towards me and grabs onto my shoulder, I feel this huge wave of energy that comes along with it. That's the best I can explain it, as a wave of energy. She makes contact with me. I feel this completely overwhelming wave of emotion and nausea. I immediately run to a trash can just a few feet away and begin dry heaving extremely heavy. No vomit comes out, but I feel so much come spilling out of my mouth, yet I don't physically see anything. Seconds later, I then begin crying uncontrollably, harder than I ever had cried in my entire life, just bawling. I crawl up in a ball, just crying my eyes out. I can feel this extremely strange emotion inside of me that I can't even begin to explain, but I just sit here on the floor and cry. I noticed my fiancée after I began vomiting. She collapsed to the floor. Even though I was crying my eyes out, I can still remember the way she fell. It was like a rag doll being dropped. Her knees just buckled and she fell to the carpet. Seconds later, my fiancée was gasping for air and crawled toward me, trying to comfort me. She repeatedly said, "I'm so sorry," over and over. It only took a minute or two, but I knew I had to leave. The emotion overwhelming me was too much to handle. Felt like I was emotionally drowning. I ran outside and my fiancé followed. As soon as I stepped outside, the sensation lifted and I felt normal again. We sat together in the driveway, not saying much, just waiting for morning to come. After that night, nothing quite as intense happened for the rest of our time there. We moved out in September 2019 when our lease ended. But even after everything calmed down, we never felt safe in that house again. I struggled to sleep under that roof, and when I did, I kept the lights on, only able to sleep for a few hours at a time. As someone who has always been skeptical about the paranormal, I still don't know what to make of what happened. I'm a person who relies on science and facts, but no matter how hard I try, I can't explain what occurred. It was undeniably paranormal, terrifying, and it still lingers in my thoughts to this day. Thankfully, nothing like that has happened since we left the house, and I hope it stays that way. I'm sharing this story as a way to vent, as I've never told anyone about it. It feels good to get it off my chest, and I want anyone who has experienced something similar to know that I'm here to listen. You're not alone. It started with a smudge. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed a faint, greasy mark on my bathroom mirror. I wiped it away, thinking nothing of it. But the next night, it was back. Only this time, it had moved. It was lower now, near the edge of the glass, as if someone had pressed their fingers there and dragged them downward. I lived alone. My bathroom door was always shut. No one else had touched that mirror. Cleaned it again. Scrubbed harder, but every night, the smudge would return, always shifting slightly, always closer to the center. Then one night I saw the handprint, a full, unmistakable handprint pressed against the glass from the other side. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The fingers were too long, the shape slightly distorted, as if whoever or whatever had left it wasn't quite human. I should have left. I should have covered the mirror, smashed it, done anything but what I did next. I leaned in closer. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, mirroring my movements exactly. And then it didn't. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a slight delay, the way my reflection's mouth lingered open just a second longer than mine. My stomach twisted, my skin prickled, then it smiled. I hadn't. The lights flickered, the reflection's grin widened. Too many teeth, stretching beyond what a human mouth should allow. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The room felt wrong, the air too thick. My reflection raised a hand, fingers twitching, and then it knocked. From inside the mirror, I ran. I slept with the bathroom door shut that night, a chair shoved against it. But when I woke up, the mirror was gone. The entire wall was smooth, blank, like it had never been there at all. But now, sometimes when I walk past windows, I catch a glimpse of something else looking back at me, smiling. I told myself it was just stress, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. But over the next few days, more things started to change. My reflection wasn't right. At first, it was subtle. A blink too slow, a delayed movement, the tilt of my head lingering an extra second. But then it got worse. One morning, as I washed my face, I looked up to see my reflection still bent over the sink. Not frozen, just waiting. I backed away, barely able to breathe. My reflection straightened at its own pace, slow, deliberate. Its lips curled into a smirk. I didn't move, but it did. A sharp knock echoed from the glass. I turned and ran from the bathroom, slamming the door shut. My chest heaved, sweat slicking my palms. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Silence. Then a whisper, faint, distorted. "Let me out." I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, unwilling to spend another second inside. I drove aimlessly, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. When I finally returned hours later, the bathroom door was open. The mirror was back, but the smudge had returned too. And this time, it wasn't just a mark. It was a word. A few winters ago, I worked as a security guard for a construction site of a 3-story industrial building that was still in development. It was a pretty sweet job. All I had to do was stay at the site between 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. I could sit in my truck the whole time, except for 2 times when I was instructed to patrol the site. I'd get out, walk around the perimeter of the site, then go inside and shine my flashlight around. It wasn't a hard job, but it did get creepy. The area was pitch black at night with no working lights, and each time I had to patrol, I felt a bit on edge. That is, until one night when it went from creepy to downright terrifying. The night was going as usual. I was sitting in my truck, watching YouTube videos, and listening to music. When the clock hit 1 a.m., it was time for my second patrol. The first one had been completely normal, so I didn't expect anything different this time. I got out of the truck and started walking down the path around the site. I had my flashlight on the whole time, scanning for anything unusual, but I didn't see anything. This walk took the longest during the patrol, and about 15 minutes in, I had circled the entire site and was back at my truck. I then headed inside the building. The truck was parked in front, so I entered through the front door. The building was still being framed, and there weren't any doors installed, including the ones leading to the outside. That's why I was there, to make sure no one could sneak inside and steal equipment or vandalize anything. When I got inside, I heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like a shovel or something had fallen. I hesitated for a moment, then started climbing the stairs to investigate. I was a bit spooked. What would I do if someone was up there? I didn't have a gun, just some pepper spray that the owners gave me. I reached the top of the stairs, shined my flashlight around, and didn't see anything suspicious. I walked around and eventually made my way to the front of the building. As I looked down at my truck through a recently installed window, I froze. There was someone sitting in my truck. He was sitting on the driver's side with his legs still hanging out, facing me. I was just about to turn around and head back down to confront him when he suddenly looked up and waved. That's when I bolted. I ran back down the stairs as quickly as I could, sprinted out of the building, and ran straight to my truck. When I got there, the guy was gone. I started freaking out and looked around with my flashlight, but saw nothing. I decided to call my boss and let him know about the situation. As the phone was ringing, I searched my truck and saw that nothing was missing and everything was where I left it. My boss didn't answer, and so I left a very short message stating, "It's 1:22 a.m. and there is someone messing around the site and I have not located him yet." I shined my light around like a madman searching for this potentially dangerous person and thought it would be a better idea to get in my truck and drive slowly around the site. This didn't take long and I didn't see anyone. I circled back to the front and parked my truck in the same exact spot that I was in before. I put the truck in park and called my boss again. I got no answer and got out of the truck once again. I stood next to my driver's side door and again shined the light around. I didn't see anyone. Then I shined the light up to the window that I had been at when I first noticed him and saw him standing in the same spot I was at, looking down at me. I realized my job was to stop people from messing around at the site, but this creeped me out so much. I got in my truck and waited until my boss eventually called back. He called the police and an officer showed up there about an hour later. He went inside the building and looked around, but never found the guy. I didn't see him again that night or any other night I was there. I have no idea who he was or why he was there. To give you some background, this happened a little over a year ago, and I still haven't been able to get over it. I'm a 22-year-old, 5 feet 4 inches female, and at the time I was 21. My family and I had recently moved to a new, more rural town than where we had lived before. Our new house was a large ranch-style house with a basement. I was home from college, and my parents had left for the week to celebrate their wedding anniversary with friends who lived several hours away. Before I continue, I'll give you a quick layout of the house to help you visualize the setting. There were 3 doors leading into the house. One on the front porch, a sliding glass door on the back porch, and another door on the other side of the wall from my bedroom, which led into the garage and basement. When you walk out of my bedroom and turn, you can see across the entire house, the kitchen, living room, dining area, the door to my parents' bedroom, and the stairs leading up from the basement. It had been a few days since my parents had left, and everything had been fine. They had sent me a couple of messages on Facebook, letting me know they had arrived at their friend's house safely and were having a good time. The day had gone well, and I made sure to check that all the doors of the house were locked once the sun went down. It was about 11 p.m., and I was going through my usual nightly routine, lying in bed and messing around on my computer, when suddenly, I got this overwhelming feeling of dread. I felt like I was being watched. It was summer, and we didn't have air conditioning, so I had a large box fan in the window blowing cool night air into my stifling hot room. But when that feeling of dread washed over me, I decided to remove the fan and close the window, just in case. After removing the fan, shutting and locking the window, and pulling down the curtain, I felt a little better. However, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay back in bed and tried to continue what I was doing, but I didn't put my headphones back on. After a few minutes, I started hearing a light scratching sound. I froze, listening carefully, trying to figure out what the sound was and if I recognized it. Our new house, although relatively close to neighbors, was surrounded by a lot of forest, so I thought it might be an animal or someone's dog that got loose and wanted to come inside. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped and everything went silent. I figured it was just an animal and felt a bit relieved, but that relief didn't last long. Shortly after the scratching stopped, I started hearing slow footsteps descending into the basement. That's when it hit me. There was someone in the house. There was no way out of the house without walking past the basement stairs. We didn't have a house phone, and at the time, I was in the process of getting a new cell phone because mine had been broken beyond repair. I sat there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. I knew I needed to get out of the house as soon as possible, and the more time I wasted, the worse things could get for me. I thought about popping the screen out of my bedroom window and jumping out, but it was far enough off the ground that there was a good chance I would get hurt. Plus, if I jumped out and hurt myself, I wouldn't be able to run for help, and I would be right next to the door that whoever was in my house had gone through. So I decided to very carefully and quietly open my door and peek out around the corner. and if the coast was clear, I would make a dash for the front door and sprint to my neighbor's house. I very slowly opened my bedroom door, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness of the house before creeping around the corner and looking to see if it was safe to make a run for it. What I saw nearly made me vomit. As my eyes scanned the house, I noticed that something was off. I squinted hard as I looked over at the basement stairs and was able to make out the shape of a man. What made it worse, he wasn't just standing at the top of the stairs, he was crawling up them like some kind of nightmare creature. I quickly backed into my room again, shutting and locking the door as quietly as I could. I didn't think that he had seen me, but there was no way that I was going to make a run for it now. My only choice was to pop the screen and jump out the window. As I was unlocking and opening my window, I heard the handle to my bedroom door turn. Once the man realized that it was locked in a sickeningly sweet sing-song voice, he cooed, "I know you're in there." This was followed by a loud cackle, and what I can only imagine was him throwing himself at full force against my door. I ripped the screen out from the window and flung myself out. I landed wrong on my right foot, and I was sure that I had broken my ankle. But at the time, I couldn't think of anything other than getting as far away as possible. I got up and ran as fast as I could to my neighbor's house, knocking on their door in a panicked frenzy and ringing the bell over and over. I looked over at my house as I was yelling for my neighbors to let me in, and I swear, I could see the man standing at my window, waving at me. My neighbors finally opened the door after what felt like forever, and I managed to explain well enough what was going on for them to let me in and call the police. I stayed with them until the police arrived. The police searched my house and found that the lock to the basement had been picked and that the door to my bedroom was hanging off its hinges. They weren't able to find the man anywhere, and because I had only seen him for a split second in the dark, I couldn't provide them with a good description. Of course, I got into contact with my parents immediately and they hurried home. The police took my statement and searched the area for the man, but of course they came up with nothing. After this event, my parents and I were sure to add deadbolt locks to the door leading into the basement and the door leading out of the basement to the rest of the house. They also helped me pay to get a new phone. What really bothers me about all of this is that nothing was stolen. There wasn't even any evidence that the guy had looked through anything while he was in my house. When I was a kid, barely a teenager, I often spent my Saturday nights babysitting my younger siblings. As the oldest of three, I assumed the responsibility with no pay or thanks, just part of my role in the family. I babysat so often because my parents needed me to. They had been through marital problems, and their counselor suggested they go on a weekly date to revive their relationship, to rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. It wasn't ideal to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents seemed genuinely excited for their date nights each week, and I could tell they were happier than they had been in a long time. I would have rather been doing other things, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I really wanted my parents to stick together. So, on the night of December 3rd, 2006, I stood at the open front door of our secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. I wrapped my arms around myself to ward off the chilly mountain air and entertained myself for a few moments by exhaling forcefully, watching my breath float away into nothing. There was truly nothing around me, no cars or creatures in sight. After a while, I grew bored and went back into the warm house, my nose tingling from the cold. George and Kate were sitting at the kitchen table, eating their dinner. As I watched them, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an only child. George, 3 years younger than me, was severely autistic and barely talked. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and then it was always in the simplest terms. Milk and sandwich meant peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was eating at that moment. Kate, on the other hand, was still a baby just shy of 2 years old. The age gap between the two of them was obvious, but to this day, my parents swear Kate wasn't an accident, though much like when I was in high school, I swore I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished their dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night, George in his room with the PlayStation 2 and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. I, meanwhile, lit the basement fireplace, dimmed the overhead lights, and settled in with a book by the glow of our Christmas tree. I read contentedly for nearly an hour. By then, night had fallen, and the room had grown cozy. I was beginning to doze off when I heard George's heavy footsteps descending the staircase. I sat upright, looking at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, his eyes narrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I replied. "Is someone at the door?" George stared at me blankly. "No more knocking," he repeated. I asked again, more clearly this time. "Did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he said again. "Knocking on window." "Knocking on window?" I said, now wide awake. I stood up. "George, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a trick on me, I thought, but being alone in a house that big made me a little jumpy. My mind raced as I processed the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told George, hand trembling slightly. I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's bedroom. "Kate." I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart pounded in my chest. I made my way down the hall to George's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder outside to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from the video game pause screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first, I did not comprehend them. I just stared transfixed at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes, a man's shoes. None of my friends wore that size. Of that, I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard. But once they passed behind the giant pine tree, they disappeared. My heart leaped to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. George sensed my fear and began to whimper. "No, no, no, Shoo," I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led George out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs into the blackness. "Can't see," George said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree, so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat George down on the couch and settled Kate into his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move." The thought raced through my mind, and panic began to creep in. I needed to call the police. I would have called my parents, but it was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. I quickly and quietly took the stairs, tiptoeing towards the phone hanging on the wall of our living room. I picked up the receiver and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it back down, picked it up again, and tried again. Nothing. I think that's when I started to cry. I couldn't help it. Fear overwhelmed me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that the storm had knocked out the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Nothing that could have possibly disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked to Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree where the footprints had stopped, but now they continued. While I had been downstairs hurting my siblings, whoever had been hiding behind the tree had moved. I followed the footprints across the frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking directly at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. This wasn't one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was staring at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, standing alone in the snow, like a dark spot on a blanket of pure white. My eyes were locked on him, and his never wavered from me. We stood there, silently staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt sick to my stomach. For the first time in my life, as I gazed into the stranger's eyes from afar, I thought of my death. I thought of my dad's brother who had been killed in an accident when he was 11, frozen forever in time, never to grow up, always remembered as the eternal youth. Tears flowed freely again as the thought hit me. "Please don't hurt us," I whispered, choking on my sobs. I knew he couldn't hear me, but I couldn't stop myself. Finally, after what felt like forever, he broke eye contact with me and looked up toward the heavens, toward the falling snow. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it. I watched, frozen, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Still looking upward, still muttering to himself, he threw whatever it was at his feet. I wanted desperately to run and grab my siblings, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I knew that letting him out of my sight would be a mistake I could never take back. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils. But he looked happy beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to George and Kate. "No more screaming," George pleaded. "No, no more screaming." I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself in the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it was trying to be quiet. I silently guided George and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe it was the hutch. He's here," the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding George with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told George to get on. "Yucky? Gross. No standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think to get George to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "George, get on the toilet now." I snarled at him, the first time I had ever done that. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet at the same time. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once, he almost slipped back down. Almost. But he was stronger than I thought he was and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him? Cold?" screamed George as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag George onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were heading toward. All I knew is what we were heading away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life, but that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I didn't let up the pace until George tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at whatever had tripped him. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see that George had fallen into blood. A dead man lay face up, his eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, making him nearly invisible until George's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pleaded, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled George to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds or so and finally reached the Garlands' front door. The window to their parlor was open, and a fire was roaring inside. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded frantically on their door. They answered together, looking utterly bewildered. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and found the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and his intestines partially hanging out of a wound in his gut. He had slipped while trying to climb to where we had gone, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was part of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone could tell, didn't exist. He claimed he was taking part in a ritual that required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and that night, his target was my autistic brother. My parents haven't shared all the details of what happened after that night, But as far as I know, the intruder is still rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife not long before he died, warning her about a suspicious man dressed in black who was stalking the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarming around the block, and their home turned into a crime scene. My father was relocated for work, and we moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. George, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if anyone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where I shouldn't. All I think about is trying to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone in my room in the dead of night, reading your worst stories about your worst times and the things that chase you in your dreams. Then, and only then, is when the real fear sets in. A few months ago, I, 22, was at the local coin laundromat late at night. I went around 10 p.m. after studying. The laundromat is small and located near the edge of the beach town I live in. This town is known for drifters and people experiencing homelessness. Most people are friendly, though there's a lot of drug use, but I'd never felt particularly scared. Everything was fine until I went to move my laundry to a dryer. I was listening to music on my headphones, but not too loudly. Suddenly, I got this feeling, like someone was watching me. It's hard to explain, but I just felt a presence. When I turned around, there was a man standing just a few feet away from me. He had pink hair and was wearing a full face mask, like a ski mask, a hoodie, gloves, and sunglasses, even though it was dark. The gloves and sunglasses especially made me uncomfortable. I thought maybe he was a drifter or high, but I didn't want to be rude. I tried to laugh it off and said he surprised me. He immediately started talking. His speech was disjointed and didn't really make sense. He talked about coming from Brazil to bring his brother money to buy a classic car. None of it seemed to add up, but he would ask me questions and wait for me to respond, so I tried to play along. I still thought he was probably just high, but he had positioned himself between me and the only exit, and I began to get a gut feeling that he was doing it on purpose. He was getting closer as he talked, and the unease in my stomach grew. Something was definitely off. But mostly, I just felt this overwhelming need to leave, while keeping him talking long enough for me to figure out how to get away. I started edging toward the side, but he stayed in front of me, and the feeling intensified. I gripped my keys in my hand, ready to defend myself. He talked some more, then backed off a little. He took off his backpack, which was a child's unicorn backpack, and set it on a nearby dryer. I glanced at the door, but when I looked back at him, he was pulling something out of his backpack and holding it behind him, out of sight. But I did see what was in his backpack. Duct tape. Instantly, it was just like an alarm went off. There was no more worrying about being rude. No more second-guessing myself that he was just off, but harmless. It was like this cold, numb dread just washed down over me. I almost felt calm, like I knew the next steps, knew I had to do something. Time seemed to move in slow motion, and he turned back to me, not saying anything anymore, and took a step forward. I gripped my keys as tightly as possible and tried to mentally prepare to fight. I remember being afraid that I would move too slow or be too weak, like in a nightmare. But all of a sudden, the door to the laundromat opened and a woman walked in, barely even looking at us as she went in to get her laundry. It was like a scene in a movie, a moment of intensity just interrupted by something innocuous, and suddenly it's over. He just turned, got his bag and left. I was so scared. I just stayed there a minute until I could get my laundry and just go home. I didn't report it. I never knew what to say since nothing had actually happened. But when I think about it, I think the scariest thing is that he left as soon as someone walked in. If he was just crazy, it wouldn't have mattered. I think a stranger's laundry timer saved me from something terrible. I don't go to the laundromat anymore. I joined a laundry service. The extra cost is worth it to never have to go back. I work as a park operator in British Columbia, managing security and collections during the night shift. One night, it was overcast and pitch black. I was parked at the bottom of the road leading to the campground, windows rolled down, just messing around on my phone as my shift was nearly over. Out of nowhere, I heard crunching footsteps coming from the passenger side window. There wasn't anything around that seemed too concerning. Since we get bears and other wildlife in the area, I thought it was probably just that. I kept listening as whatever it was moved around, but I could tell it was on edge. Then the footsteps started to pick up speed, like something was running straight at my truck. It was so dark, and I had my hands up, expecting something to burst through the window at any moment. Just before I thought it would crash into the side of the truck, everything went dead silent. I decided that was enough and quickly started the truck, speeding up to the cabin to get away from whatever was out there. At this point, I was already on edge, so I just kept telling myself, lock the gate and go home. Just lock the gate and go home. However, before I could leave in my own vehicle, I had to put the truck keys away in the shop, which was inside a fenced-off compound, unlit and just perfect for freaking me out. I pulled out my phone, turned on the dim LED light, and started walking to the shed. Every little noise, every crunch of a leaf made me jump. I walked through the compound gate and, as I passed by the motor pool area, I heard a horrifyingly loud screech, like an alarm going off. At that point, I was in full fight or flight mode, fists in the air, ready to run. The sound kept going, and I realized it was the noise a golf cart makes when it's in reverse. Normally, you'd know if the cart was left in reverse because the sound would stop once you parked it. So my mind was racing. What the hell turned that on? I carefully moved closer, scanning the area with my phone's light, scared out of my mind. I ran up quickly and pulled the reverse lever off, half expecting it to be some kind of trap straight out of a horror movie. But there was nothing. I threw the park truck keys at the shed and bolted back to my truck. I started it up, turned on every light I had, unlocked the gate faster than I ever had before, and even checked the back seat to make sure no one had snuck in. Reflecting on it now still makes me uneasy. Working in parks is great, but man, the night shift can be really creepy. Just to give you some context, I'm from Kentucky, where there's a lot of wooded land, and guns are a big part of life. I'm no exception. I used to be pretty skeptical about anything unknown lurking in the woods. Bigfoot? Maybe, but I highly doubted it. After what happened, I can say for sure there's something out there that we don't understand. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, a Ruger AR-556, and while Gander Mountain was going out of business, I picked up a 60-round drum magazine because, well, why not? The drum was supposedly great with very few issues, so I was pretty excited to try it out. A few days after getting it, I decided it was time for a test run. I was going to sight in my rifle, and that's where things took a strange turn. As I mentioned, Kentucky is incredibly wooded. 3/4 of the land where I live is just thick forest. There's a main path for driving the gator, and a few smaller trails our cows made, but other than that, it's pretty untouched. I decided to walk along the creek, where a small path had been partially cleared by the cows. At the end of the path is a big field where the cows graze, and I usually sight in my guns there when the cows aren't around. As soon as I crossed the fence to enter the field, I felt this sudden, intense sensation that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off because I'd walked back there countless times without any issue, but the feeling didn't go away, and I could tell something was off. I kept walking, but I couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched. I was consciously aware of it, but I didn't let it distract me. The walk along the creek is short, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. But as I walked further, that feeling of being watched intensified, like whatever was observing me was getting closer. By the time I was halfway to the field, the sensation was so strong I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had the drum magazine with me, but it was unloaded, so I stopped to load it up. I only brought 20 rounds because I was just planning to sight in the gun, and that should have been more than enough. As I was loading the magazine, the smell of something dead hit me. It smelled like something had been rotting in the sun for a while. I looked around, and right behind me, I found what was left of a possum. It had been torn apart. It almost seemed like it had been placed there for me to find. The strange part was that it looked like it had only been dead for maybe a day at most, but the smell was so much more decomposed than that. This obviously didn't sit well with me, so I double-timed it on the magazine loading. In hindsight, I guess I should have taken the dead possum as our last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going though. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid or something. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable at this point. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Me being on edge immediately turned toward the noise, gun ready, but no round in the chamber, and walking down the creek away from me was something that I'll never forget. It was at least 8 feet tall, probably taller, really skinny. I mean, imagine a grown man that weighs 120 pounds and now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. It had very long arms and walked on 2 legs. Skin stretched tightly across its body, and it made no noise aside from the splash when it stepped into the creek while it walked. It also had a very weird walk, almost like a waddle but taking large steps, but that could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer or something, and that's all I can remember. Now I knew why I felt while I was being watched. Magazine loaded, bolt ready to send a round into the chamber, I got myself steady. Remember what I said earlier about the magazine being extremely reliable? Well, I pressed the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round, just in case this monstrous thing decides to attack or something. I didn't intend to strike first or anything though, but the round, it gets stuck somehow and doesn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't foul from heavy use or anything, and a bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger. So why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that the thing had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again after that too, and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them that this happened. I just told them that the magazine failed several times. Anyway, the gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing books it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just long enough exposure to it to get the details that I provided earlier. But now for assumptions. It happened about late May last year. I still have the emails from Magpul regarding the drums, so I'm using those as reference because after this I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided that it could have been a Wendigo. I know it sounds crazy, but the reason we think it was a Wendigo is because everything I described matches them near perfectly. I had read that they were incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, which explains the smell of the possum. That they're very fast, can be several colors, light brown included, and that they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans away. Again, the possum. The only thing that we couldn't come up with was its behavior. Why am I still alive if this Wendigo actually existed? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it really did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me, and it ran for me like it was scared or trying to draw me to somewhere where it wanted me to be. This all being said, I've never had another encounter with it. I've gone to the same field, taken the same path expecting to be watched, and have not gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day ever since. Something was definitely out there, and you or anyone else can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking that I'm being watched out there, and it still had no comparison between that day. If any of you guys have ever seen anything like this, I sure would be grateful for some comments. Anyway, I just needed to talk about this to get it off my chest. Also, sorry for the novel, guys, but I felt like I needed to include every detail that I could to better explain the situation. The little details really bring out how absolutely fucked I could have been. Every little thing just happened to line up to screw me. I had never heard of shadow people before, and I didn't know what to call what I saw. But one day, I decided to type Shadow Hat Man into a search engine, and what I found completely shook me to my core. I read about countless encounters with the entity, but none were quite like mine. Most stories were about seeing it at night, either in the hallway or in some dark corner, but not mine. What I saw happened in broad daylight, just a couple of feet in front of me. Here I am, 17 years later, and it still gives me the creeps. So, I was about 12 or 13, it was a Saturday morning, and I had the day off from school. I slept in until about 9:30 or 10 a.m. I woke up, had breakfast with my mom and dad, and they got into a huge fight. Then they went into their bedroom on the other side of the house to continue arguing. I watched some cartoons, and then around 11 a.m., I decided to go brush my teeth. The bathroom in our house had the sink just about 2 feet inside the door, right in front of it. So I walked in and started brushing my teeth. There was also a large mirror on the wall, but at first, I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. Then, I had this sudden sinking feeling, like someone was standing behind me. I knew my parents were still arguing, so I didn't think much of it at first. But when I glanced in the mirror, I saw nothing. Yet the fear still gripped me. I turned around, and that's when I saw it, standing right outside the bathroom doorway, just a few feet away. It was broad daylight, and this thing was right in front of me. It was tall, towering over me. In fact, it must have had to crouch to fit in the doorway. It was completely dark and shadowy, but the most horrifying part were its glowing red eyes. It just stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Even now, I still have nightmares where something awful is happening, and I'm trying to scream, but nothing comes out. Then, it reached out its hand towards me, its fingers pointing outward, long, skinny, dark fingers. Now that I think about it, it kind of reminds me of a Dementor from Harry Potter. With its hand outstretched, it took a step towards me. Frozen with fear, I thought, asterisk, this is it. My life is over. Asterisk then, after another step forward, with its hand still reaching, it just vanished, gone in the blink of an eye. I took that chance and ran straight to my parents. They obviously didn't believe me and probably still don't to this day. My mom shrugged it off, and my dad just laughed at me, which didn't surprise me. He'd be the dad in the horror movie saying, "Nothing's wrong with this house," while pots and pans floated in midair around him and all kinds of crazy things happened. After that, I always closed the bathroom door when I went in, and I slept with the light on for years. Anyway, I heard another story about a shadow person sometime later, and it inspired me to share my own experience. To this day, I still wonder what the heck happened and what it wanted, but I guess I'll probably never know. The security camera feed flickered to life, revealing 3 masked figures creeping through the darkened office. In that moment, I realized my boring night shift had just turned into a fight for survival. My name's Mike, and I'm a night security guard at Pinnacle Enterprises, a tech company housed in a sleek high-rise in downtown Chicago. Most nights, my biggest challenge is staying awake. But tonight, I'm trapped in a building with armed intruders, limited resources, and no backup. This is the story of how I outwitted a crew of professional thieves and lived to tell the tale. Started like any other night. I arrived at 10 p.m., relieved the day shift guard, and settled in for my usual routine of monitoring security feeds and making hourly rounds. The building was always eerily quiet at night, just the hum of electronics and the occasional whir of the HVAC system. Around 2 a.m., I was on my 3rd cup of coffee, idly flipping through the camera feeds, when something caught my eye. A shadow moved across the lobby camera where there shouldn't have been any movement. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. There it was again, definitely a person trying to stay out of the camera's main field of view. My heart rate picked up. This wasn't some employee working late. The figure was dressed all in black, their face obscured by a ski mask. As I watched, 2 more similarly dressed individuals joined the first. "Shit," I muttered, reaching for the phone to call the police. But as my hand touched the receiver, the screen went dark. All the screens went dark. The entire security system had just gone offline. These weren't amateurs. They had somehow cut the building's main power, and the backup generator hadn't kicked in. I was flying blind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had two choices. I could try to get out of the building and call for help, or I could stay and try to stop whatever was happening. The smart thing would be to leave, but something inside me couldn't just walk away. I checked my equipment: flashlight, radio, pepper spray, and a baton. Not exactly an arsenal, but it would have to do. I knew the building layout like the back of my hand. That would have to be my advantage. Quietly, I slipped out of the security office and into the darkened hallway. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow, creating more shadows than illumination. I could hear muffled voices from the executive offices on the top floor. I made my way to the stairwell, careful to avoid the squeaky spots I'd noted during my nightly rounds. As I climbed, my mind raced. What were they after? Pinnacle dealt in cutting-edge AI technology? Their servers probably held 1 million in intellectual property. I reached the top floor landing and peered through the small window in the stairwell door. Two of the intruders were working on the lock to the CEO's office while the third stood guard, a nasty-looking gun in his hands. My mouth went dry. This was real. These guys weren't messing around. For a moment, I considered retreating, finding a place to hide until they left. But then, I thought about all the people whose livelihoods depended on what was in those servers. I couldn't just let these thieves walk away with it. I needed a distraction, something to split them up. My eyes fell on the fire alarm on the wall. It was powered by a separate battery system. Perfect. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. Then I pulled the alarm. The sudden piercing wail shattered the silence. Through the door's window, I saw the intruders jump, looking around wildly. The leader gestured frantically, and they split up, one heading towards the stairs where I was, the other two continuing to work on the office door. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it over the alarm. The door burst open and the masked figure rushed in. As he passed, I struck, swinging my baton with all my might at the back of his knee. He went down with a cry of pain, his gun skittering across the floor. Before he could recover, I was on him, using zip ties from my belt to secure his hands behind his back. One down, two to go. I grabbed the fallen gun, checking to make sure the safety was off. I'm no marksman, but I know how to handle a firearm. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring. Keeping low, I crept down the hallway towards the CEO's office. The alarm was still blaring, but I could hear the sound of breaking glass over it. They must have given up on picking the lock and decided on a more direct approach. I reached the corner and risked a quick glance around it. The two remaining intruders were inside the office now. I could see the glow of a laptop screen. They were already accessing the servers. I had to act fast. Taking a deep breath, I stepped around the corner. Gun raised. Freeze, I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Hands where I can see them. They spun around, clearly surprised. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, faster than I could react, one of them reached for his weapon. I fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, shattering a framed photograph on the wall. But it had the desired effect. Both men dove for cover, giving me a chance to duck behind a heavy wooden desk. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, rent-a-cop." One of them called out. "Why don't you make this easy on yourself and walk away? We're not here for you." "Can't do that," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "Whatever you're stealing, it's not yours to take." A harsh laugh. "Noble. Stupid. But noble. Last chance. Walk away now or we'll put you down." In response, I popped up and fired again, aiming for the computer. The screen exploded in a shower of sparks, and I heard cursing from the other side of the room. "You'll pay for that," the voice growled. What followed was the most intense few minutes of my life. We exchanged gunfire, neither side able to get a clear shot. I was pinned down, but so were they. It was a stalemate, and we all knew it. But they were professionals, and I was just a security guard running on adrenaline and luck. Eventually, that luck would run out. I needed to end this, and fast. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything I could use. That's when I saw it. The fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the intruder's position. Taking careful aim, I fired. The extinguisher erupted, filling the air with a thick cloud of white powder. In the confusion, I made my move. I vaulted over the desk, charging towards the coughing, disoriented thieves. I tackled one, driving him to the ground. We grappled, rolling across the powder-covered floor. He was strong, but I had desperation on my side. Somehow, I ended up on top. I landed 2 solid punches before he went limp beneath me. Breathing hard, I zip-tied his hands, then looked up to find the third intruder. He was gone. Cursing, I got to my feet. The powder was settling, visibility improving. Where could he have gone? A noise behind me made me spin around. The last thief was by the window, a bag slung over his shoulder. He had a grappling gun aimed at the building across the street. Our eyes met. Even through the mask, I could see the cold calculation in his gaze. He was weighing whether he could take the shot before I fired. "Don't," I said, my gun trained on him. "It's over. Police will be here any minute." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he lowered the grappling gun. "Well played. Rent a cop," he said, a hint of grudging respect in his voice. "Didn't think you had it in you." As if on cue, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. The cavalry was finally arriving. The next hour was a blur of police statements, paramedics checking me over, and a very surprised CEO showing up to survey the damage to his office. By the time things calmed down, the sun was rising, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of pink and gold. As I sat on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, the police chief approached me. "You did good tonight, son," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Not many people would have had the guts to do what you did." I nodded, too exhausted to form words. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving me feeling drained and slightly in shock. Had I really just single-handedly foiled an armed robbery? "Get some rest," the chief continued. "But when you're up for it, come down to the station. I think we might have a job for you that's a little more suited to your skills than night watchman." As he walked away, I couldn't help but laugh. 24 hours ago, I was a bored security guard counting the minutes until my shift ended. Now I was a hero with a possible future in law enforcement on the horizon. I looked up at the Pinnacle Enterprises building, the top-floor windows still dusted with fire extinguisher residue. Whatever they were going to pay me to clean up this mess, it wasn't going to be enough. But as I watched the 3 masked men being led away in handcuffs, I felt a surge of pride. I had protected what I was meant to protect. I had made a difference. Not bad for a night's work. As the ambulance doors closed and we pulled away from the scene, I leaned back, finally allowing my eyes to close. I had a feeling sleep wouldn't be a problem today. And for once, I was actually looking forward to my next shift. After all, who knew what excitement it might bring? Family reunions are supposed to be about reconnecting and making happy memories. No one tells you they can also be about uncovering dark secrets and fighting for your life. I learned that lesson the hard way at our lake house last summer. It had been years since the entire family had gathered together. Life, as it often does, had scattered us across the country. So when Grandpa suggested we all meet at the old lake house in Minnesota for a week, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, the gravel driveway crunching under my tires as I pulled up to the sprawling wooden house. The lake gleamed in the distance, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was exactly as I remembered from childhood summers. Grandpa was the first to greet me, his weathered face lighting up with a broad smile as he pulled me into a bear hug. "Good to see you, kiddo," he said, though I was well into my 30s by then. Over the next few hours, the rest of the family trickled in. Aunts, uncles, cousins, faces I hadn't seen in years, all gathering in the large living room, catching up, reminiscing. The atmosphere was joyful, filled with laughter and the excited chatter of reunited relatives. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle at first. A tension in the air, quick glances exchanged between certain family members. My Uncle Dave, in particular, seemed on edge. He kept checking his phone, his brow furrowed with worry. I tried to brush it off, but my journalist instincts were tingling. Years of chasing stories had sharpened my ability to sense when something wasn't quite right. As night fell and most of the family retired to their rooms, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The lake house had a beautiful wraparound porch, perfect for stargazing. I leaned against the railing, enjoying the cool night breeze when I heard hushed voices coming from around the corner. "Can't keep this up much longer, Dad." Uncle Dave's voice was strained and angry. "The creditors are breathing down my neck. I need that money now." "Patience, David." Grandpa's voice, usually so warm and kind, had a hard edge to it. "We'll sort this out, but not at the expense of the family legacy." "Legacy?" Dave scoffed. "What good is a legacy if we're all bankrupt?" I held my breath, not daring to move. What was going on? What money were they talking about? "The trust fund stays where it is," Grandpa said firmly. "It's for all of the grandchildren, not just to bail you out of your bad investments." There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of footsteps stomping away. I waited a few minutes before quietly making my way back to my room, my mind reeling with questions. The next morning, I woke early, the conversation from the night before still echoing in my head. As I made my way to the kitchen for coffee, I passed by Grandpa's study. The door was ajar, and I could see him inside, poring over some papers. "Everything okay, Grandpa?" I asked, pushing the door open a bit more. He looked up, startled, then quickly shuffled the papers into a drawer. "Of course, sweetheart. Just some boring old paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about." But I could see the worry lines etched deep in his forehead, the way his hands shook slightly as he closed the drawer. The day progressed with family activities, swimming in the lake, a big barbecue lunch, board games in the afternoon. But underneath the veneer of familial happiness, I could sense currents of tension. Uncle Dave was sullen, barely participating. Grandpa kept disappearing into his study. And Aunt Sarah, Dave's wife, seemed to be watching everyone with a calculating gaze. That night, unable to sleep, I decided to do some digging. I knew it was wrong to snoop, but my curiosity and concern for Grandpa overrode my better judgment. I crept down to the study using the flashlight on my phone to navigate. The drawer Grandpa had so hastily closed was locked, but years of picking locks for investigative stories came in handy. Inside, I found financial documents, legal papers, and a thick folder labeled trust fund. As I flipped through the papers, a picture began to emerge. The family's wealth, which I had always assumed came from Grandpa's successful business, was actually old money, very old money. And it was tied up in a complex trust that Grandpa controlled. Uncle Dave, it seemed, had made some risky investments and lost big. He was deeply in debt and had been pressuring Grandpa to release the trust fund money early. But doing so would mean less for the rest of the grandchildren when we came of age. I was so engrossed in the documents that I didn't hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. The study door creaked open, and I looked up to see Uncle Dave standing there, his face a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, advancing into the room. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. "Dave, I can explain." But he wasn't interested in explanations. In 2 quick strides, he was across the room, grabbing my arm roughly. "You nosy little brat. You have no idea what you're meddling in." I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me, Dave. You're hurting me." "Oh, I'll do more than hurt you if you don't keep your mouth shut," he growled, his face inches from mine. I could smell alcohol on his breath. "This is none of your business. You understand me?" Suddenly, another voice cut through the tension. "Let her go, David." Grandpa stood in the doorway, his usually kind face hard with anger. Dave released me, stepping back. "Dad, I can explain." "Enough." Grandpa's voice cracked like a whip. "I've had enough of your excuses, your threats. This ends now. What followed was a heated argument that woke the entire house. Family members came rushing in, confusion turning to shock as the truth came out. Uncle Dave's debts, his desperate attempts to get the trust fund money, even threats he had made against Grandpa. In the chaos that ensued, I slipped out onto the porch, my head spinning. How had a simple family reunion turned into this nightmare of secrets and betrayal? As dawn broke over the lake, casting a pale light over the scene, the police arrived. Someone, I later learned it was Aunt Sarah, had called them. Uncle Dave was taken away in handcuffs, shouting accusations and threats. The rest of us sat in stunned silence in the living room as Grandpa finally told us everything. The trust fund, the family's hidden wealth, Dave's spiral into debt and desperation. It was like something out of a soap opera, except it was happening to us, to our family. "I'm sorry," Grandpa said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was protecting you all by keeping this secret. I never imagined it would come to this." In the days that followed, we rallied around Grandpa. The reunion, needless to say, was cut short. But as traumatic as the experience had been, it had also brought us closer together. We really talked, for the first time in years, about the secrets, about the money, about what it meant to be a family. Uncle Dave eventually pleaded guilty to charges of attempted extortion. Aunt Sarah filed for divorce. The trust fund was restructured, with more transparency and safeguards put in place. As for me, I could no longer look at our family the same way. The rose-tinted memories of childhood summers at the lake were now tainted by the knowledge of the secrets and lies that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. But there was a silver lining. In uncovering the truth, in confronting the darkness that had lingered in our family's shadows, we found new strength, new honesty in our relationships. The lake house, once a symbol of carefree summers and family unity, now stood as a reminder of how quickly things can change and how the people we think we know can surprise us, both for better and for worse. As I drove away at the end of that tumultuous week, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the lake house growing smaller in the distance. I realized that family isn't just about shared blood or happy memories. It's about facing the hard truths together, about choosing to stand by each other even when the facade of perfection crumbles. The next family reunion, we decided, would be held somewhere new. A fresh start, free from the weight of secrets hanging over us. And as I merged onto the highway, heading back to my life, I felt a mix of sadness and hope. Our family had been shaken to its core, but we had survived. And maybe, just maybe, we would be stronger for it. The lake house disappeared from view, and with it, the last vestiges of my childhood innocence. But ahead lay a future where our family, battle-scarred but resilient, could build something new, something real. And that, I realized, was worth more than any trust fund. The mist rolled across the lake, thick and suffocating. As I cast my line into the dark, endless water, I had come out here seeking solitude, seeking peace. Instead, I found a nightmare lurking in the fog, a ghost ship that would transform my tranquil fishing trip into a battle for survival against an unimaginable evil. My name's Mike, and I've been fishing these waters since I was a kid. Lake Erie may not have the fame of the other Great Lakes, but it's always been my haven. When life gets too loud, too chaotic, I come out here. Just me, my small fishing boat, and the endless stretch of water. That night began like any other. I pushed off from the dock just as the sun dipped below the horizon, ready for a few hours of night fishing. The weather report had predicted fog rolling in, but I wasn't concerned. I knew this lake like the back of my hand. As the night deepened, the fog thickened in a way I'd never seen before. I could barely see the front of my own boat, but I wasn't worried. The fish were biting, and the eerie calm of the fog-covered lake was strangely soothing. It was nearly midnight when I first heard it, a low, sorrowful sound that echoed across the water. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, louder this time, a ship's horn. But it wasn't like any I'd ever heard before. It sounded old, rusted, like something that hadn't been used in decades. I squinted into the fog, trying to make out any shapes. That's when I saw it, a massive silhouette emerging from the mist. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It was a ship, sure, but not the kind that should be on Lake Erie. It was an old steamer, the kind used for hauling iron ore back in the early 1900s. Its hull was rusted, its deck eerily empty. At first, I thought it might be some kind of historical replica. But as it drifted closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. The ship was gliding silently, with no sound of engines or sign of a crew. There was something off about it, like I was seeing it through a heat haze, even though the night air was cold. My curiosity began to overpower my growing sense of dread. I started my engine, slowly edging closer to the mysterious ship. As I drew alongside, I could finally make out the name painted on the hull, Edmund Fitzgerald. My blood ran cold. The Edmund Fitzgerald was infamous around here, an enormous freighter that sank in a storm on Lake Superior in 1975, taking all 29 of its crew with it. What I was seeing wasn't possible. I was about to turn my boat around and get the hell out of there when I heard it, a voice calling out from the deck of the ghost ship. "Help us," cried, weak and desperate. "Please help us." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to flee, but I couldn't just leave if there was someone in trouble. Swallowing my fear, I maneuvered my small boat alongside the towering hull of the freighter. There was a rusted ladder hanging down the side. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed hold and started to climb. The metal was ice cold under my hands, covered in a slick layer of algae that made the climb treacherous. As I hauled myself onto the deck, the full weight of my mistake hit me. The deck was empty, devoid of any signs of life. But more than that, it felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with a scent I couldn't quite place, like rust and seaweed and something else, something rotten. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast emptiness of the ship. "Is anyone here?" I heard a call for help. Silence was my only answer. I took a step forward and nearly fell as the deck seemed to shift under my feet. It wasn't the gentle roll of waves. It was as if the very structure of the ship was unstable, changing. That's when I saw them, shadowy figures moving at the edges of my vision. Every time I turned to look directly at one, it would vanish. But I could feel them watching me, their unseen eyes boring into my back. I knew I needed to get off the ship, and fast. But as I turned back to where I'd climbed aboard, my heart sank. The ladder was gone. The edge of the deck now hung over empty air, fog swirling below where my boat should have been. Panic started to set in. I was trapped on a ghost ship surrounded by something. Entities I couldn't see but could feel all around me. I had to find another way off. I made my way towards what I hoped was the bridge, figuring there had to be some kind of radio or emergency equipment there. The door was rusted shut, but adrenaline gave me the strength to wrench it open. The bridge was like stepping back in time. Ancient-looking equipment lined the walls, dials and levers that looked like they belonged in a museum. And there, slumped over the ship's wheel, was a figure. Hope surged through me. "Hey," I called out, moving closer. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't move. As I approached, I realized why. What I had thought was a person was nothing but a skeleton, clothed in the tattered remains of a captain's uniform. I stumbled back. A scream caught in my throat. This was madness. Impossible. I had to be dreaming. A noise behind me made me whirl around. There, blocking the doorway, stood a man, but not a living man. His flesh was bloated and pale, his eyes milky white. Seaweed clung to his clothes, and water dripped constantly from his form. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice gurgling as if he were speaking underwater. "We've been waiting for you." I backed away, my mind reeling. What are you?" The thing that had once been a man smiled, revealing rows of sharp, fish-like teeth. "We are the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, lost but not gone. And now you'll join us." More figures appeared behind him, all in various states of decay. They began to advance into the bridge, their hands outstretched towards me. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed a heavy log book from a nearby desk and hurled it at the lead figure. Passed right through him, but the action startled them enough for me to make a break for it. I shoved past them, their cold, wet hands grasping at me as I ran. I could hear them behind me, their water-logged footsteps pounding on the deck. I ran without direction, taking random turns through the labyrinthine interior of the ship. Every door I passed through seemed to lead somewhere different than it should have, as if the internal geography of the vessel was constantly shifting. Finally, I burst out onto the deck again, but it wasn't the same deck I'd first climbed onto. This one was tilted at a sickening angle, water sloshing over one side. With a jolt of horror, I realized the ship was sinking. The ghostly crew was still behind me, getting closer. In desperation, I ran for the railing and, without allowing myself time to think, I jumped. The shock of the cold water drove the air from my lungs. For a moment, I was sure I was going to drown, but then my survival training kicked in. I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air. The ghost ship was gone. There was nothing but fog all around me. I treaded water, trying to get my bearings. That's when I heard it. The distant hum of a motor reached my ears. I screamed for help, my voice hoarse and filled with panic. The sound grew louder, and suddenly, a beam of light sliced through the thick fog. It was a Coast Guard boat. As they pulled me from the water, I frantically told them about the ghost ship, the undead crew. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly convinced that I was delirious. It wasn't until later, after a hospital visit and a clean bill of health, that I learned the truth. There had been a string of disappearances on the lake over the past few months, each occurring on foggy nights, all near the area where I had my encounter. The official report claimed it was a mass hallucination, possibly caused by a toxic algae bloom. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I don't go out on Lake Erie anymore. I can't bring myself to step foot on a boat. But sometimes, on those foggy nights, I find myself drawn to the shore. And as I stand there, watching the mist roll in, I swear I can still hear it. The deep, mournful sound of the Edmund Fitzgerald's horn, calling out across the water, summoning new souls to join its cursed crew. And I wonder, how many more will answer that call before the ghost ship is finally laid to rest? When I was in middle school, my family moved into my mom's childhood home to take care of my grandpa. The property is nestled in the woods near Lake Michigan, and everyone calls it the Valley. I grew up listening to my aunts, uncles, and cousins tell their scary stories about living there. As soon as we moved in, we quickly learned why the Valley truly is the most sinister place we've ever been. At the time, my mom worked the third shift while my dad ran his own business from our garage. One night, I needed to talk to my dad, but he wasn't in the house. Figuring he was probably working in the garage, I peeked outside to check. Across the yard, I saw that all the lights in the garage were on, and I could hear what sounded like the radio blaring. I was completely convinced that my dad was in the garage, so I decided to leave the safety of the house. I focused on the bright light of the garage and started running across the 100 feet of pitch-black yard. As I stepped into the light of the garage, a sense of relief washed over me as I called out for my dad. But that feeling quickly faded as I realized something was very wrong. The deafening silence hit me, and my dad was nowhere to be seen. I had just heard the radio a moment ago, but now all I could hear was my own panicked breathing. I never would have made the terrifying trip across the yard if I hadn't heard that sound. Before my heart could even start to calm down, I turned around and ran back to the house. What had taken me maybe 30 seconds now only took 10. I was so terrified that I focused solely on the door and getting back inside. When I burst through the door, I found my dad in the living room, looking like he'd been there for hours. Like so many other terrifying experiences in that house, I didn't think much more about it and just moved on. It wasn't until we moved out a few years later that I was reminded of what happened that night. My family often shares their scary stories about the valley, and one night we were telling them again. When it was my brother's turn, his story sounded all too familiar. My brother described needing to talk to our dad, seeing the lights on, and hearing the radio blaring in the garage just like I had. He ran across the dark yard, only to discover the same thing I did, nothing.
No radio, no dad.
But it was the next part of his story that sent chills down my spine. While I tried to block out the fear and focus only on the door, my brother made the mistake of scanning his surroundings as he turned back toward the house. To his absolute horror, he saw a distinct form on the roof. A silhouette of a man stood completely still, right above the door he needed to use to get back inside. The shape was so dark, it stood out against the trees around it. I don't know how my brother found the courage, but he ran back to the house like a wild animal and slammed the door behind him. Hearing his version of events made me wonder. If I had looked up when I approached the door, would I have discovered that I wasn't alone either? Here in the UK, we don't have elementary schools, but we do have junior or primary schools, which are kind of the same thing. You go to them from around 4 to 11 years old. So, while they're not exactly the same as American elementary schools, I think this story fits into that age group. Anyway, this is the scariest thing that happened to me while I was at junior school. The school I went to had a really small playground. There were only about 100 kids in the entire school, so the concrete play area was only about 50 meters across. It was tiny. If something happened on the playground, every single kid and teacher could see it, which I suppose was convenient for them, but not so much for me when something happened to Louis. One day, we were all running around the playground, as little kids do, not thinking about anything, when suddenly, I heard one of the teaching assistants scream, really loudly, "Louis!" I remember it was autumn because I was playing with some fallen leaves when I heard that blood-curdling scream. Without thinking, I spun around, just like every other kid on the playground, to see the teaching assistant kneeling by Louis, who was lying on the concrete with blood pouring out of his mouth. It wasn't just a little drip. It was a steady stream of blood that was flowing out of the corner of his mouth and pooling on the ground beneath him. That was bad enough. But the part that really got to me was that he was completely unconscious, and his eyes had rolled up into his head. All we could see were the whites of his eyes while he bled uncontrollably. A bunch of us ran into the coat room. Some kids were crying, some were pale and in shock. I can't speak for the other kids, but I definitely thought that Louis was dead. I had never seen anything like that before. When my friend Ewan broke his leg falling off a swing set, he screamed in pain until the ambulance came. I knew he was alive, even though it was distressing. But Louis? He was out cold, bleeding like crazy. And his eyes. I didn't even know eyes could do that when I was that age. Afternoon classes basically got canceled. The kids were just distraught, so no one was in any fit state to be concentrating on lessons. We were just kept in our classrooms until we were all called into the main assembly hall to hear the news about Louis. We didn't get all the gory details, only that Louis had taken a fall in the playground and had banged his head. We were told that he had been taken to the hospital and that he was okay, but that he would be out of school for a week or so while he healed up. Louis was back before we knew it. We were all super relieved to see him. I remember the first day he was back, we all gathered around him as he showed off the big scar inside his lip, where he had fallen on his face. He had also lost a few baby teeth, which I guess was lucky as he was about to lose them anyway, I suppose. That was definitely the most terrifying thing I ever saw during my childhood. I mean, I'm 32 now, it's been like 25 years or so since it happened, but I remember the whole thing as clear as day. It just burned into my memory. Those eyes, the whites of his eyes, there's something I'll never ever forget. The moment the lot clicked shut behind us, I knew we were in trouble. What had once felt like a charming home now seemed like a trap. As night fell and strange sounds echoed through the hollow rooms, we realized that what was supposed to be a routine property showing had turned into a fight for our lives. I'm Emma, a real estate agent with almost a decade of experience. I've come across my share of peculiar properties, but nothing could have prepared me for what transpired that day. It was meant to be a straightforward showing of a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that typically appeals to history lovers and restoration enthusiasts. My clients, the Johnsons, were a lovely couple in their 30s, looking for their dream home. They had fallen in love with the photos online and were eager to see it in person. I had already visited the property once to pick up the keys and do a quick walkthrough, but something about the place had unsettled me. I dismissed it as the usual eerie feeling old houses tend to give off, thinking nothing of it. We arrived at the mansion just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The dimming light stretched long shadows over the neglected lawn, making the house seem more imposing than I had remembered. "Oh, it's perfect," Mrs. Johnson gasped as we stepped onto the creaky porch steps, her voice full of wonder, just like something out of a Gothic novel. If only we had known how right she was. The inside of the house was striking, though a bit musty. High ceilings, ornate woodwork, and enormous windows that would let in plenty of daylight. But as we moved through each room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "And this," I said, pushing open a heavy oak door, "is the master bedroom." The moment we stepped inside, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind us. We all jumped, then nervously laughed. "Old houses, you know," Mr. Johnson said with a forced laugh. "Always full of surprises." We pressed on, moving up to the third floor. That's when things started to take a strange turn. As we entered what appeared to be an old study, the temperature dropped suddenly. Mrs. Johnson shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "Is there a draft in here?" she asked. Before I could respond, we all heard it. A low, mournful sound, like someone crying. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What was that?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice tight with tension. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. These old houses make all sorts of noises, but deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. It sounded too human. We decided to cut the tour short and head back downstairs. That's when we realized we were trapped. Every door we tried was locked, including the front door we'd come in through. Even the windows wouldn't budge. "This isn't funny, Emma," Mrs. Johnson said, panic edging into her voice. "Let us out." "I'm not doing this," I insisted, my own fear rising. "I don't know what's happening." As if in response, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Mrs. Johnson screamed, and I felt Mr. Johnson grab my arm. "We need to find a way out," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "There has to be a key or something." We used our phone flashlights to search the house, looking for anything that might help us escape. But as we moved from room to room, it became clear that we weren't alone. Shadows moved at the edge of our vision, disappearing when we turned to look. That crying sound grew louder, sometimes right behind us, sometimes far away. In the kitchen, we found an old rotary phone. To our surprise, it had a dial tone. I quickly dialed 911, hope surging through me. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "Please, we're trapped in a house at 1313 Oakwood Lane," I said in a rush. "The doors are locked. We can't get out. There's something here with us." There was a pause. Then the operator spoke again. But it wasn't the same voice. This one was deep, distorted, barely human. "No one's coming to help you," it growled. "You belong to the house now." The line went dead. We stared at each other in horror, the reality of our situation sinking in. We were on our own. As the night wore on, the house seemed to come alive around us. Doors slammed on their own. Objects moved when we weren't looking. And always that crying sound, sometimes turning into screams that made our blood run cold. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to separate. Mrs. Johnson was praying quietly, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Johnson kept trying to break a window with a fireplace poker, but the glass wouldn't even crack. Around midnight, things escalated. A chair flew across the room, narrowly missing Mr. Johnson's head. Books launched themselves off shelves. And then we saw it. A figure, translucent and glowing faintly, hovering at the top of the stairs. It was a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Her face was twisted in a mask of sorrow and rage. When she spoke, it was the same distorted voice we'd heard on the phone. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "No one ever leaves." She floated down the stairs, other ghostly figures emerging from the walls to join her. They surrounded us, their cold presence making it hard to breathe. In that moment, I remembered something I'd read in the property history but had dismissed as local legend. The house had once belonged to a wealthy family in the 1800s. The daughter had fallen in love with a man her parents didn't approve of. They'd locked her in the attic until she agreed to marry someone else. Instead, she'd taken her own life. "I'm sorry," I said, addressing the ghost directly. "What happened to you was terrible, but we're not the ones who hurt you. Please let us go." The ghost paused, her form flickering. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of humanity in her eyes. "It's too late," she whispered. "We're all trapped here, forever." But something had changed. The other ghosts were retreating, fading into the walls. The main ghost, the daughter, I realized, remained. "There is a way," she said, her voice sounding more human now. "In the attic, my room, find what was taken from me." With that, she vanished. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and we heard a click. The attic door had unlocked. We raced up the stairs, hope giving us new energy. The attic was dusty and cluttered, filled with old furniture and boxes. In the corner was a small room, more of a cell, really. And there, on a decaying vanity, we saw it. A locket, tarnished with age. The moment Mrs. Johnson picked it up, the house seemed to tremble. Then we heard it, a sound like 1,000 voices exhaling in relief. The front door creaked open, and the first rays of dawn poured into the hallway. Without a second thought, we ran from that house, sprinting until we reached my car. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the ghostly figure of a girl standing on the porch, smiling. But just as quickly, she was gone, and the house was nothing more than a silhouette in the distance. We never talked about what happened that night, not to anyone. Who would have believed us? The police report claimed we had simply been locked in, due to a malfunctioning door mechanism. The house was eventually demolished, and the land became a park. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the sound of crying in my dreams, and I think about that ghost girl and all the others trapped within those walls. Did we truly free them? Or are they still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to walk through the door? I no longer show old houses. The risk is too high now that I know some places carry a history that can't be captured in photos or listed in a property report. Some homes are more than mere structures. They're prisons for lost spirits, waiting for the right moment to break free or to lure others into sharing their eternal suffering. So if you're ever house hunting and you come across a stunning old mansion, especially with a price that seems too good to be true, think twice before stepping inside, because you'll never truly know what awaits behind those doors. And once they lock, there may be no way out. Just a few days ago, I had the strangest experience in the more than 10 years I've been driving a cab. I picked up this well-dressed, good-looking middle-aged man, but when he opened his mouth, he said the strangest things. What started as an entertaining conversation quickly turned into a source of all-consuming fear. Let me explain. It was Saturday night, and I was working the graveyard shift. Most of my fares come from bars, and I had just dropped off a pair of drunk women. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed a well-dressed, tall man waving me down. His fancy suit and the neighborhood we were in made me think he might be a big tipper. Once he got in and shut the door, he removed his hat, a fine-looking straw fedora. His clothing and movie star looks seemed out of place. At first, I thought maybe I had picked up a time traveler. I did the usual and asked him where he was headed. He replied, "I don't really know. I'm in town on business, and I was looking for someone to show me around." Couldn't help but chuckle. It seemed awfully late for a sightseeing trip. "As long as you're paying, mister, I'll drive you anywhere," I said, trying to be accommodating. And that was how it all began. For the next 2 hours, I drove him around town, showing him the university, the Capitol building, the usual tourist spots. At some point during our little tour, I remembered why he had said he was in town. "So, what kind of business are you in?" I asked casually. His reply made me laugh even harder than the first one. The guy had a knack for comedy. I'm what some people would call a contract killer. We'd been having such a good time up until that point that I decided to play along. Okay, mister, I'll bite. Tell me how it works. How does one go about hiring a contract killer? Well, he started, a woman contacts me. How they do so, I'll keep to myself. If their references check out, we move on to business. She gives me the names and any other info I ask for. If I decide to take the job, we move on to money. I was intrigued and curious, so I pressed on. How do you make sure you get paid after you, well, off someone? The choice of words seemed to amuse him, and he laughed. It probably wouldn't be wise to tell you that part. We professionals have to keep some secrets. Fair enough, I said. Well, then, how does a client know you've completed the job? Even before I finished asking, I regretted it. It was a stupid question, but he still entertained me with an answer, tinged with sarcasm in his voice. We live in a time with a 24-hour news cycle and multiple social media outlets. Don't you think if your dad died suddenly, that someone's not going to contact your mother first? If you don't discover it on your own, someone is going to tell you. Once I'm paid, my relationship with the customer ends. She's ultimately on her own after that. The last part of his answer brought up another question in my mind. If something goes wrong per se and she gets arrested or implicates herself, what do you do? He thought for a moment before answering. I imagine he was considering how much he should say to a stranger driving his taxi. Some contingencies have been put in place to protect myself. First off, if I have done my job right, the client shouldn't have any information about me to give to the cops. And if, on the off chance, I screw up so badly that I have multiple exit strategies, I certainly won't let the police get their hands on me. None of us get to live forever. There were a few times I had to remind myself that this was a game. He made it fun, nonetheless. His imagination and forethought wowed me. We had been playing this game for hours before I had thought to ask him how he got started in his business. I joined the Army fresh out of high school. It seemed my work caught the attention of my superiors. They referred me to a couple of gentlemen in the government, and I worked for them for 10 years before I made the decision to go into business for myself. I gotta tell you, mister, you're really good at this stuff. You really should be a storyteller, if that's not what you're really doing for a living. I'm seriously impressed, and I wasn't blowing smoke. This was the most fun I had had driving a cab in my entire life. I was used to dealing with drunks and arrogant businessmen. This was a blast. Thank you, young man. I appreciate everything you have shown me tonight. I could tell by the way he was talking that night was coming to an end. It was just as well. The sun would be up soon, and I was beginning to flag myself. I took the opportunity to ask one more question, one I should have asked far earlier. He had said earlier in the night that he was in town on business. Did that mean he was here to take care of someone? A sly grin grew across his face as he thought on his answer. As a matter of fact, I was. However, I received a message at the last minute to cancel the hit. I get to keep the half she had already given me, so I didn't mind. That's business. It happens on occasion. That's a woman's prerogative after all. Isn't it? To change their minds. I hope her and her old man work it out. Anyhow, that's how I ended up with you. Just as the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, he pointed out a place to let him out. There were a few hotels at the end of the parking lot, and I assumed that was where he was headed. He reached over the seat and handed me $10,100 bills. Before I could argue, he told me to keep the change. Keep the change, kid. You earned it. I had a great time tonight. Thank you, mister. I had a great time myself. And thank you most of all for that awesome story. As he stepped from the cab, he said one last thing. Thank you for showing me around tonight, Adam. Take care of Linda and stay out of trouble. I pulled out of the lot and headed for home. My hope was that Linda would have breakfast going. That was when it hit me like a hammer. How did that man know my name? Not to mention my wife's. My license was nowhere near him, so there's no way he could have seen it. I replayed the conversation in my mind over and over. There was never a point where I told him anything. It would have ruined the game. I never asked for his name, and there was no reason for me to tell him mine, certainly not my wife's. How did he know I was married? Anyway, I hadn't worn a ring in years. I lost it down a drain and never found it. He could have guessed, I suppose. The problem with that idea is that Linda and I had only just gotten back together last week. We had been separated for 2 years and were even considering divorce. When I pulled into the driveway that night, an awful thought crossed my mind. Could it be possible that the guy wasn't just making up a story? No one would tell a stranger something so bold and frank, especially not that he was a hitman. If he was serious and he knew my name and my wife's, it could only mean one thing. But even if it was true, I wasn't ready to accept it. While Linda and I sat and ate breakfast that morning, I couldn't stop watching her. A terrible thought kept creeping into my mind. Was it possible that my wife had wanted me dead? Even if she had changed her mind, there was no way she would admit it. If I asked, no matter what she said, it could destroy the fragile peace we had been trying to rebuild. I need to know, am I crazy? Or is this really happening? What do you think? One night, I was hanging out with my aunt and uncle when they randomly asked me if I believe in Bigfoot. I said, I do not, but I certainly had an experience I can't explain away. My buddy and I were passing through rural McKean County, Pennsylvania, in the Appalachian foothills after spending time at my family's hunting cabin in neighboring Potter County. I was telling him about McKean County's main tourist attraction, the Kinzua Bridge, which was once the world's tallest railroad bridge. Sadly, a few years ago, a tornado took down the middle section of the bridge in the dead of night, leaving only parts of it anchored into the hillside. Down below, rusted steel beams twisted and jutted out, reaching dozens of feet into the air. Despite it being almost midnight, my buddy wanted to do some old-fashioned trespassing to check it out. I agreed. It was late and remote with no one around. We hopped over the flimsy security fence, just a chain-link fence that wouldn't even stop an 8-year-old, and walked up to what remained of the bridge. The full moon was out, and we were now about 100 feet above the valley floor, standing on the remnants of the old monolith. We were doing the usual stupid teenage, young 20s guy stuff, leaning over the edge, spitting, peeing off the side. You know, the usual. After a while, we started ripping off chunks of the railroad ties. It was unsettling how easily we could break something that had been in use just a short time ago. We threw the pieces off the bridge, making a lot of noise. But when one hit the ground, the sound was nothing compared to what happened next. The scream that followed will forever stick in my mind. It was loud and terrifying, almost impossible to describe. It sounded half like a primate and half like industrial machinery, like metal screeching and hydraulics hissing. Then, whatever it was we had angered started sprinting through the forest below us. With the full moon, we had good visibility, and we could see sizable trees bending under something massive's weight, moving with incredible speed and strength. The noise it made, its footsteps and the grunts, was nothing like any animal I'd ever heard before. I've seen black bears running in the wild, and I've witnessed rhinos sprinting through a safari in South Africa, but neither of those creatures made nearly as much noise as this thing did. The noise was deafening. Whatever it was had to be colossal. When I got back to my home in central Ohio, I searched online for recordings of bear or mountain lion calls. Nothing even came close to what we heard. I still haven't found anything that sounds like it in all the documentaries and camping trips I've done. When I finished my story, my aunt and uncle's jaws were on the floor. Turns out there was a Bigfoot show on TV at the time, and they had just watched an episode about the Kinzua Bridge. I had no idea about the show or that episode, and neither did my buddy. So, I don't believe in Bigfoot. I've never found any conclusive evidence. No prints, droppings, or carcasses. It seems nearly impossible for something of that size not to leave clear evidence. It's more likely that my buddy and I shared a delusion, but we weren't impaired, and we weren't scared until we heard that noise. What we experienced that night was real, and I'll never forget it. I want a rational explanation, but almost 10 years later, I've found absolutely nothing that explains what happened. I went on a date with a guy I met on Craigslist when I was 17 years old. I had posted an ad looking to meet someone, and I don't remember all the details. But a guy responded who lived nearby, so I emailed him back and gave him my number. He was one of the few who responded without sending a creepy message. He introduced himself as John, and he said he was 26 years old. John and I talked for 2 days before we met up on a Friday night. We exchanged texts and he asked if I was single. I said yes, and he asked about my favorite food because he wanted to take me out to dinner. I asked him some questions, and he told me that he still lived with his mom but had the top floor of the house to himself. He also mentioned that he was a part-time model and made good money. Based on his photo, his modeling story seemed believable. So, on Friday night, John came to pick me up. He drove a silver 2-door car. He texted me to let me know he was waiting outside. So after checking my hair and makeup one last time, I said goodbye to my parents, telling them I was heading out with friends, and then left. When I got into John's car, the first thing I noticed was that he looked exactly like his photo. He had pale skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. He looked a little older in person, but he made up for it with his snappy fashion sense. He looked really cool. He was incredibly kind, and his body language and smile made me feel at ease. I know it's really stupid to go on a date from Craigslist, but surprisingly, this guy was normal. We chatted for a while as he started driving away from my hometown, heading toward the highway. He wanted to take us to a city for dinner, about a 25-minute drive. During the journey, John started to reveal more about himself. He told me he was embarrassed to admit that he still lived with his mother, and he worried that I might think badly of him for not having his own place at his age. As we got closer to the highway, I can't really explain it, but something about him started to put me off. It wasn't anything creepy, but I just started feeling uneasy. You know when you're on a date with someone, and they say something that's a huge turnoff, even if it's not overtly creepy? It was that kind of situation. He didn't say anything wrong, but I just started feeling off. As we got closer to the turnoff, I said, "I'm really sorry. I don't feel like going to dinner anymore. I'm not feeling well." John's initial reaction was sympathy. He asked if I was okay and if it was his driving. I told him I just didn't feel well. But then he kept asking me, "What did I say? What did I do?" I told him it wasn't him. It was me, and I just wanted to go home because I wasn't feeling good. He said, "Okay, just let me drive you around for a bit before I take you back. I don't want to end the evening like this." I knew that if he didn't take me home, I'd have to walk over an hour or more. So I agreed that driving for a bit sounded fine. But instead of turning around and heading back to my house, he veered off and started driving toward the town where he lived. I should mention that it was pitch black outside, and his town was surrounded by dense woods. This isn't even worth mentioning if you take the highway and proper turnoffs to get there. But he decided he wanted to go via the back roads because it's more scenic, despite the fact I couldn't see a thing. John had gone from being incredibly talkative to almost completely silent. He kept driving further into the wooded area. A few times I'd asked him questions about himself to break the awkward silence. At one point, I put my hand on his knee affectionately, trying to regain the friendly, flirty banter that we had had before. He blanked me for the most part, occasionally answering in soft grunts or nods. It was like he was having a tantrum. John pulled into the parking lot for the forest. It was around 9 p.m., so naturally it was totally empty. He slowly kept driving, looking around for other cars, and then parked the car upright at the end, close to the woods. There was nobody else in the parking lot, and I hadn't even seen us pass other cars to get there. For 10 minutes, he just sat there, staring into the darkness ahead, which was disturbing. I think I managed to make small talk for maybe 5 minutes, which is a long time when someone isn't talking back. Then I joined him in his silence. I was afraid of appearing fake. I didn't want him to think I was scared. So some time of silence goes past, and abruptly John gets out of the car, closes the door and locks the car. I was stuck inside. His lights were on so I could sort of see ahead. In front of the car was a field that maybe went on for about 20 feet, and then beyond that were trees and dense forest. To the left was the rest of the car park and the exit at the far end, and to the immediate right was more forest with a small path. John disappeared into the forest ahead. I tried the handle on the door. It would not open. I began to rationalize this. Maybe he accidentally locked the door. I was telling myself if he really wanted to do something, he would have stayed in the car. With no sight of John, I decided I needed to call someone. I looked around for my phone, and I couldn't find it. This was an old silvery pay-as-you-go flip phone. I was confused that I couldn't find it because I had put it right next to me in the cup holder. After looking for it for a good few minutes, I became sure that he had taken it. Mind you, I didn't want to start rooting around his car, knowing he might be watching me. I didn't want him to catch on that I was freaking out. At that point, I started looking for my phone with only my eyes instead of making it obvious. I was petrified. This guy was watching me panic in the darkness. My eyes were darting all around the floor. Nothing. I looked up and squinted into the field and forest ahead. I saw him. John was standing about 10 feet from the car in that small field. He was standing and smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. He looked terrifying. This was not the same guy that I got in the car with. I looked ahead and smiled back. I was still trying to act like his behavior was normal, like nothing he was doing was scary. Still smiling. His tongue began to protrude from his mouth. He stuck it out all the way. He began wagging his tongue up and down while maintaining eye contact with me. I felt myself trembling. I was trying to compose myself, not taking his eyes off of me, and with his tongue still out, he started unzipping his pants and then began to urinate in front of me while staring at me the whole time. This is the point. I found it difficult to act like I was in on his behavior. I looked down at the floor, not wanting to watch what was in front of me. He didn't creep or slink back to the car. Instead, I hear his thundering steps and then a slam against the window. I guess at this point, I was the luckiest person alive because another car pulled into the parking lot. I don't know what this did to John, but immediately he got back into the car and laughed at me, that normal laugh, and said, "So what music do you like? I'll put it on while I drive you home." And he did. He drove me all the way home. When he pulled up to my house, I went for the door, but it was still locked. "I want you to promise me something." I asked him what that was. I told him, if you ever see me after this, turn the other way. Act like you don't know me. If you see me with my family, don't you dare say a word. I don't expect to bump into you, but don't say anything." He agreed, and then I asked him, "Have you seen my phone?" He told me no. I guess losing my phone was a small sacrifice, considering how surprisingly I made it home safely. Once I was inside my house, I said goodnight to my parents and went upstairs to my room, then turned on my computer. I wanted to gather as much information about the guy as I could. Back then, I used MSN Messenger, kind of like AOL Instant Messenger. It logged in automatically whenever I started up my PC. Now, before I get to the final part of the story, it's important to tell you this. One day before, I had been at my best friend's house. We had that kind of friendship where we would try to one-up each other with jokes, mostly just making fun of each other for laughs. The day before, my friend had changed 2 contacts in my phone. She replaced the contact labeled Mom with a guy that I had been texting back and forth with. I immediately realized she had done this because I saw the previous messages pop up, but I didn't bother changing the numbers back at the time, thinking I'd just do it later. So when I logged onto MSN Messenger, I saw tons of messages from this guy and a few from my best friend. When John had locked me in the car, he took my phone and texted Mom, which was actually this guy. The message said, "I'm sorry, but I've decided to move out. I've met someone. Please don't look for me. I am happy being left alone." The guy knew something wasn't right, and he quickly texted back, "I don't think this is you. I know where you went, and I'm calling the police." This was incredibly quick thinking on his part, as he had no idea where I was. I think that text saved my life that night, and it explains John's sudden change in behavior. If it wasn't the random car that pulled into the parking lot, it was that text. This happened 3 years ago when my twin brother and I were 15. Our bedrooms were right next to each other on the bottom floor of the house, while my parents' master bedroom was on the second floor. One night, I woke up to some noise coming from my brother's room. I sat up in bed, And a minute later, I heard my mom walk by with my brother, and it sounded like they were arguing. My brother has nightmares often, and that night, he claimed he saw someone looking through his window at him. He grabbed his cell phone and called my mom while the stranger stood there. By the time he was telling her what was happening, the person disappeared right before she reached his room. My mom thought it was just a nightmare, but my brother insisted he was awake and that someone was outside. My dad investigated, but there was no one there. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was woken up abruptly when my brother entered my room in a panic. I asked him what the hell he was doing, irritated, and he was almost in tears. He said, "That guy is back. He's outside my window." The tone of his voice made a chill run down my spine. I knew then that he wasn't dreaming or having a nightmare. We sat in my dark bedroom, and before we could think about what to do next, we heard a thump on the wall. My bed was pressed up against the wall, and on the other side was my brother's bedroom. He looked at me in terror. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but before I could, we heard a second, louder thump. We sat there in disbelief, and a minute later, my phone started ringing. It scared the hell out of us. I silenced the phone but didn't answer. It was my brother calling. I looked at him in horror and confusion, then showed him the screen of my phone. His eyes went wide, and he started trembling. I rejected the call and immediately called my dad. He answered in a tired voice, and I told him someone was in the house. He didn't want to believe it at first, asking me what I was talking about. I told him again, and then I heard him rush down the stairs. He opened my bedroom door, and my brother and I told him that just a few feet away, in my brother's room, there was an intruder. My dad had never faced anything like this, and I could tell he was scared when he realized he had to check it out. My brother and I followed closely behind him. The window was open, and my brother's cell phone was lying on the floor in the middle of the room. The next day, we installed cameras around the house. Whoever was in my brother's room hasn't come back since. We think the person must have seen us setting up the cameras.